In the vast tapestry of Azeroth's history, few names carry the weight and controversy of Hellscream. It is a name that echoes with the thunder of battle cries, that resonates with both glory and tragedy in equal measure. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your resting place and let the tensions of the day drift away like clouds across a darkening sky, we shall explore the complete story of one who bore this legendary name. This is the tale of Garrosh Hellscream, son of Grommash, a warrior whose journey would take him from the depths of shame to the heights of power, and ultimately to a fate that would shake the very foundations of the Horde he once led. Let your breathing slow and your mind open to the story of ambition, pride, and the heavy burden of legacy that shaped one of Azeroth's most complex and divisive figures. To understand Garrosh Hellscream, we must first understand the legacy he inherited, for the weight of a father's deeds can shape a child in ways both profound and lasting. The Hellscream lineage began with warriors whose battle cries were said to freeze the blood of their enemies, whose ferocity in combat became the stuff of legend among the orcish clans of Draenor. The name itself spoke of their terrible power in battle, of the screams that accompanied their charges, sounds that seemed to come from the very depths of some hellish realm beyond mortal understanding. The origins of the Hellscream name are lost to time, but the legends speak of an ancestor who faced a pit of fire and emerged screaming in triumph, his voice carrying the rage of the flames themselves. Whether this story is literal truth or metaphor matters little, for it captures the essence of what it meant to be a Hellscream. These were orcs who never yielded, never faltered, never accepted defeat, even when all hope seemed lost. Their bloodline was marked by an intensity that bordered on madness, a refusal to submit that made them either the greatest of heroes or the most terrible of monsters. Grommash Hellscream, known to his allies simply as Grom, rose to become the chieftain of the Warsong clan, one of the most fearsome and aggressive of all the orcish clans. His lean, powerful frame and distinctive jaw made him instantly recognizable among his people, but it was his eyes that truly set him apart. Those eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of barely contained violence, of a warrior spirit that could never truly be at peace. Under his leadership, the Warsong clan became known throughout Draenor as peerless warriors, raiders whose very approach sent lesser beings fleeing in terror. The orcish clans of Draenor had lived for generations in a warrior culture that valued strength and honor above all else. They hunted the great beasts of their world, fought amongst themselves in ritual combat, and forged a society built upon the foundations of martial prowess. The shamans among them communed with the elemental spirits of the land, and for countless generations, the orcs existed in a rough harmony with the red world they called home. But this way of life was destined to change, for forces beyond their understanding had taken notice of the orcish race and recognized in them the potential for terrible destruction. The Burning Legion, that endless army of demons that sought to consume all life in the cosmos, had found in the orcs a people perfectly suited to their dark purposes. Through their agent Gul'dan, a power-hungry shaman who had forsaken the elemental spirits for the promises of demonic power, the Legion began to corrupt the orcish race from within. Gul'dan formed the Shadow Council, a secret cabal of warlocks and corrupted shamans who worked to turn the orcs into weapons of the Burning Legion. Their ultimate tool of corruption was the blood of Mannoroth the Destructor, a pit lord of immense power whose essence could bind those who consumed it to the will of the Legion. When the time came for this terrible ritual, it was Grommash Hellscream who stepped forward first. His burning desire for power, his unquenchable thirst for greater strength in battle, made him the perfect first victim of this corruption. As the assembled chieftains watched, Grom lifted the cup containing Mannoroth's blood to his lips and drank deeply. The effect was immediate and transformative. His brown skin began to shift, taking on a sickly green hue that would eventually spread to all who drank the demon blood. His already formidable strength increased dramatically, but so too did his aggression, his bloodlust, his capacity for violence without restraint. One by one, the other chieftains followed Grom's example, and with each one who drank, the fate of the orcish race was further sealed. The blood curse spread through the clans like a plague, transforming the orcs from a proud warrior culture into something far more dangerous. The green tint of their skin marked them as changed beings, creatures now bound to powers they did not fully understand. The ancestral connection to the elements that had guided their shamans for generations began to wither, replaced by the fell magic that the warlocks promised would bring them glory and conquest beyond imagination. It was in this corrupted state that the orcs launched their invasion of Azeroth, pouring through the dark portal that connected Draenor to this new world. The first war saw the destruction of the kingdom of Stormwind as the orcish horde swept across the land like a tide of green-skinned fury. The human kingdom, caught off guard by this invasion from another world, fell before the orcish onslaught. King Lane Rin was assassinated by the half-orc Garona, and the survivors fled north to seek refuge with the other human kingdoms. The Second War followed, a grander conflict that drew in not only the human kingdoms, but also the dwarves, gnomes, and high elves of the Alliance. The Horde expanded as well, pressing trolls and ogres into service and even enslaving the red dragonflight through demonic magic. The battles raged across the eastern kingdoms, from the shores of Lord Aeron to the gates of Ironforge, as two worlds collided in a struggle for survival. But the Alliance proved stronger, and at the Dark Portal, they finally broke the orcish invasion, shattering the Horde's power and beginning the long process of rounding up the survivors. The orcs who remained on Azeroth were placed in internment camps, their once proud spirits seemingly crushed by defeat and the lingering effects of the blood curse's withdrawal. Without the demon blood to fuel their aggression, many orcs fell into a lethargy that their captors mistook for docility. They sat in their camps, shadows of the fearsome warriors they had once been, waiting for a fate that seemed likely to end in either death or eternal captivity. Few could have imagined that this broken people would one day rise again to become a major power on Azeroth. But before the Sun Wars, before the invasion, before even the drinking of Mannoroth's blood, a child had been born to Grommash Hellscream and his mate Golka. This child was Garrosh, and his birth would be marked by circumstances that would shape his entire life in ways both tragic and defining. Shortly after his birth, or perhaps when he was still very young, Garrosh contracted a terrible illness known as the Red Pox. This disease, while not always fatal, was highly contagious and dangerous enough that those who contracted it were immediately quarantined away from the general population. Young Garrosh was sent to Garadar, a village in Nagrand that served as a place of healing and isolation for those afflicted with the red pox. The village was led by Gaia, a wise elder who had named the settlement in honor of her late husband Garad. Here, far from the Warsong clan and far from his father, Garrosh would spend his formative years. He was removed from the events that would transform the orcish race, separated from the corruption that claimed his father and so many others. When the other orcs drank the blood of Mannoroth and their skin turned green with demonic taint, Garrosh and the other quarantined orcs remained untouched, their brown skin a mark of their freedom from the curse. These orcs who had escaped corruption would eventually take the name Mag'har, meaning uncorrupted in the orcish tongue. They represented what the orcish race had once been before the influence of the Burning Legion, before the blood curse, before the madness of the wars on Azeroth. But for young Garrosh, this distinction brought little comfort. As he grew to maturity among the Mag'har, he learned of his father's actions, of how Grommash Hellscream had been the first to drink the demon blood, the one who had led his entire race down the path of corruption and destruction. The shame that settled upon Garrosh's shoulders was crushing. He carried within him the legacy of the orc who had damned his people, and this knowledge poisoned his sense of self-worth. While other young orcs trained and dreamed of glory, Garrosh withdrew into himself, believing that he was destined to repeat his father's mistakes, that the corruption in his blood would eventually manifest no matter how he tried to resist it. He became melancholic and withdrawn, a sharp contrast to the fierce warrior spirit that characterized most orcs. The other Mag'har looked upon him with a mixture of pity and disappointment, seeing in him a waste of the Hellscream bloodline's potential. The elders of Garadar tried to counsel young Garrosh, to help him see past the burden of his father's legacy. Gaia herself, the wise matriarch who led the village, took a particular interest in the troubled young orc. She had known Grommash before the corruption, had seen the potential for greatness in the Hellscream line, and she believed that same potential existed within Garrosh if only he could find the strength to embrace it. But her words, however kindly meant, could not pierce the armor of shame that Garrosh had constructed around himself. The other young orcs of Garadar found Garrosh's melancholy confusing and sometimes frustrating. They had heard the stories of his father's ferocity in battle, of the terrible war cry that had given the Hellscream clan its name, and they expected to find those same qualities in the son. Instead, they encountered an orc who seemed determined to hide from his heritage rather than embrace it. Some tried to challenge Garrosh, to provoke the warrior spirit that surely lay dormant within him, but their efforts typically resulted in sullen withdrawal rather than the fierce response they anticipated. The physical environment of Nagrand, with its floating islands and lush grasslands, provided a backdrop of natural beauty that seemed to mock Garrosh's internal turmoil. The Mag'har hunted the great clefthooves and talbuks that roamed the plains, celebrated their victories around roaring campfires, and maintained the warrior traditions that had defined orcish culture for generations. Garrosh participated in these activities when required, displaying the physical prowess that his bloodline demanded, but there was no joy in his victories, no satisfaction in his achievements. Every success felt hollow, every accomplishment tainted by the knowledge of what his father had done. In Garadar, Garrosh grew to physical maturity, developing the powerful frame and imposing presence that marked his lineage. But his spirit remained broken, weighed down by the burden of his father's legacy. He took no joy in training, found no purpose in the daily life of the Mag'har village. When others spoke of the Horde that his father had helped create, of the wars fought on a world called Azeroth, Garrosh heard only confirmation of his bloodline's shame. He did not know that his father had ultimately found redemption, that Grommash had broken free of Mannoroth's control and sacrificed his life to free the orcish race from the blood curse. The events of Azeroth seemed impossibly distant to the Mag'har of Nagrand. They knew that the dark portal had been closed, that their corrupted brethren had vanished to wage war on another world, but the details of what transpired beyond that portal remained largely unknown. Garrosh grew up without knowledge of his father's heroic end, without understanding that Grommash had ultimately redeemed the Hellscream name through the greatest possible sacrifice. This ignorance allowed his shame to fester and grow, becoming the dominant force that shaped his personality and outlook on life. The isolation of Garadar from the wider events of orcish history created a peculiar bubble of existence. The Mag'har knew that something terrible had happened to their people, that most of the orcs had left Draenor through a magical portal to wage war on another world, but the specifics remained shrouded in rumor and speculation. Travelers who passed through the village brought fragments of information, tales of battles won and lost, of cities built and destroyed, but none could provide the complete picture that Garrosh needed to understand his father's legacy. The psychological toll of growing up as the son of the orc who cursed his entire race cannot be overstated. Every time Garrosh looked at his brown skin, a mark of his freedom from the blood curse, he was reminded that his father had been the one to spread that curse to others. When the other Mag'har spoke of the corrupted orcs with pity or contempt, Garrosh heard condemnation of his own bloodline. The walls of his shame were built brick by brick through years of such moments, until they seemed impenetrable. Some of the elders of Garadar tried to reach out to young Garrosh, to help him understand that he was not his father, that each orc must be judged by their own deeds rather than the actions of their ancestors. Mother Gaia, in particular, spent many hours attempting to counsel the troubled youth, sharing with him the wisdom she had accumulated over decades of leading the Mag'har through difficult times. But Garrosh's shame had grown roots too deep to be pulled out by words alone. He needed something more powerful than counsel to break free from the prison of his own making. The warrior training that all young Mag'har received provided Garrosh with skills that would eventually make him one of the most formidable fighters in the Horde. His body responded to the training, even as his spirit remained listless, developing the strength and reflexes that his bloodline demanded. Instructors noted his potential and lamented his lack of motivation, seeing in him a warrior who could have been legendary if only he could find the will to embrace his destiny. The years passed slowly in Garadar, each day much like the one before. The Mag'har maintained their traditional ways, hunting the great beasts of Nagrand, honoring the spirits in the old manor that the corrupted orcs had abandoned when they embraced fel magic. Garrosh participated in these activities with minimal enthusiasm, going through the motions of orcish life without truly engaging with it. He was respected for his bloodline, but pitied for his broken spirit, seen as a cautionary tale of how the sins of the father could destroy the potential of the son. But everything changed when the dark portal reopened. The Burning Crusade, as this new conflict would come to be called, saw the forces of Azeroth pushing into Outland, the shattered remnant of what had once been Draenor. The portal that had once carried orcish armies to wage war against humanity now served as a gateway for adventurers and soldiers from both the Alliance and Horde, who came to this broken world to confront new threats and old enemies. Among those who came through the portal was Thrall, Warchief of the reformed Horde, who had heard tales of orcs who had never drunk the demon blood and wished to meet these Mag'har for himself. Thrall was unlike any orc that the Mag'har could have imagined. Raised as a slave among humans, he had eventually escaped and united the scattered orc clans into a new horde, one built upon honor and the shamanic traditions that the corrupted orcs had abandoned. He had known Grommash Hellscream personally, had fought alongside him, and had been present when Grom made the ultimate sacrifice to free his people from demonic bondage. The journey across Outland had shown Thrall the devastation that the orcish corruption had ultimately wrought. Draenor, the world that his ancestors had called home, had been torn apart by the reckless use of fel magic, transformed into the shattered realm now known as Outland. Continents floated in the void, connected only by tenuous magical bridges, and entire ecosystems had been destroyed by the demons who had once promised the orcs glory and power. It was a sobering reminder of what the blood curse had cost the orcish race. His journey brought him eventually to Nagrand, to the village of Garadar, and to a meeting that would forever alter the course of Garrosh Hellscream's life. Thrall was unlike any orc Garrosh had ever encountered. Raised among humans as a slave, Thrall had eventually escaped and reunited the scattered orc clans into a new horde, one built upon honor and the restoration of the old shamanic traditions rather than demon-fueled conquest. He had known Grommash Hellscream personally, had been there when Grom made his final sacrifice, and he carried within him the complete truth of the elder Hellscream's story. When Thrall learned of Garrosh's existence, of the shame that consumed the son of his old friend and ally, he knew he had to intervene. The meeting between Thrall and Garrosh was initially awkward. Garrosh's shame manifested as hostility, as defensiveness, as a desperate desire to push away anyone who might remind him of his father's crimes. But Thrall was patient, understanding the psychological burden that Garrosh carried, and he was determined to show the young orc the truth. Using his shamanic powers, Thrall conjured a vision of the past, showing Garrosh the events that had transpired in Ashenvale when Grommash faced Mannoroth for the final time. Garrosh watched in stunned silence as the vision unfolded before him. He saw his father, green-skinned and fierce, confronting the massive pit lord whose blood had cursed the orcish race. He saw Thrall fall before Mannoroth's power, saw the demon lord mock Grommash and declare that the orcs would forever be slaves to the Legion. And then he saw his father rise, saw Grommash charge at the pit lord with Gorehowl raised high, saw the legendary axe bite deep into Mannoroth's skull, in a blow that would cost Grom his life, but would also free the orcs from the blood curse forever. The vision showed Grom's final moments, showed Thrall kneeling beside his dying friend as the green tint faded from Grommash's skin. In his last breath, Grom spoke of freedom, and Thrall responded that he had not merely freed himself, but had freed his entire people. Garrosh watched as his father died a hero's death, and the revelation shattered the shell of shame that had imprisoned him for so many years. Garrosh Hellscream was not merely the orc who had first drunk the demon blood. He was also the orc who had broken the curse, who had given everything to undo the terrible mistake he had made. The transformation in Garrosh was immediate and profound. The shame that had weighed upon him for so long was replaced by a fierce pride in his lineage. His father was a hero who had redeemed himself through the ultimate sacrifice, and Garrosh was the inheritor of that heroic legacy. The melancholy that had characterized him since childhood burned away, replaced by an intensity that would come to define him. He was a Hellscream, son of the orc who had freed his people, and he would prove himself worthy of that name. The psychological transformation that Garrosh underwent in that moment would shape everything that followed. For years, he had defined himself through negation, through what he was not, through the legacy he wished to escape. Now, suddenly, he had a positive identity to embrace, a heritage he could claim with pride rather than flee in shame. But this new identity was built on the foundation of his father's glory rather than achievements of his own, and this distinction would prove crucial in the years to come. The vision that Thrall showed Garrosh was, in its way, a kind of magic that the shaman did not fully appreciate at the time. By revealing the truth of Grommash's redemption, Thrall had intended to free Garrosh from the burden of shame that imprisoned him. What he had not anticipated was that the same revelation would create new burdens, new expectations, new pressures that would prove just as constraining as the shame had been. Garrosh went from believing he was the son of a monster to believing he was the son of a hero, and both beliefs carried their own weight. The other Mag'har of Garadar watched Garrosh's transformation with a mixture of relief and concern. They were glad to see the young orc finally emerging from his shell, finally embracing the warrior spirit that his bloodline demanded. But some of the elders noticed how quickly his demeanor changed, how completely the melancholy was replaced by its opposite. They wondered whether this new confidence was genuine growth or merely the swing of a pendulum, whether Garrosh had truly healed or simply traded one extreme for another. Thrall saw the change in Garrosh and recognized both its power and its danger. The young orc's newfound confidence was built upon a fierce pride that could easily tip into arrogance, and his desire to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy could lead him down problematic paths. But Thrall also saw in Garrosh a potential leader, a symbol that could help unite the Mag'har with the Horde and bring fresh perspective to the orcish people. He invited Garrosh to return to Azeroth with him, to take his place among the orcs of the Horde, and to serve as an advisor to the Warchief. Garrosh accepted this invitation with an eagerness that reflected his transformed state of mind. For the first time in his life, he had purpose, direction, a reason to embrace his heritage rather than hide from it. He bid farewell to Garadar and the Mag'har who had raised him, promising to bring honor to their people in this new world. The journey through the dark portal marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would eventually see him rise to the highest position in the Horde and then fall further than perhaps any orc before him. His first sight of Orgrimmar filled Garrosh with wonder and pride. The great orcish city, carved into the harsh landscape of Durotar, stood as a testament to what his people could achieve. The massive gates, the towering buildings of wood and metal, the bustle of activity as orcs, trolls, tauren, and other races went about their business. All of it represented the Horde that Thrall had built from the ashes of defeat. Garrosh was the first of the Mag'har to set foot in Orgrimmar, and he could feel the weight of history upon him as he walked through those mighty gates. Many of the Horde's inhabitants looked upon Garrosh with curiosity, and some with awe. Here was the son of Grommash Hellscream, the offspring of the hero who had freed the orcs from their demonic masters. His brown skin marked him as Mag'har, as one who had never been corrupted, and this distinction carried its own significance. He represented both the past, what the orcs had been before the blood curse, and the future, a new generation of leaders who might guide the Horde to greater heights. The architecture of Orgrimmar reflected the orcish values of strength and functionality. Great spikes of metal jutted from buildings and walls, both decorative and defensive. The streets were wide enough to accommodate the massive war machines that the orcs had learned to build, and the central complex of Grommash Hold dominated the city's skyline. This fortress, named in honor of Garrosh's own father, served as the seat of power for the Warchief and the heart of the Horde's government. To walk beneath its shadow was to feel the weight of orcish history pressing down upon one's shoulders. Thrall took personal responsibility for Garrosh's integration into the Horde, spending many hours with the younger orc, discussing the challenges that faced their people and the role that Garrosh might play in addressing them. The Warchief spoke of diplomacy and patience, of building alliances and maintaining peace with the alliance, of the importance of controlling the aggressive impulses that had led the old Horde to disaster. Garrosh listened to these lessons, but they sat uneasily with the fierce pride that had replaced his former shame. Where Thrall saw the value of restraint, Garrosh increasingly saw weakness. The other races of the Horde presented their own challenges for Garrosh to understand. The trolls of the Darkspear tribe, led by the cunning vol'jin, had been with the Horde since its refounding and had proven themselves valuable allies. The tauren, those massive bull-like people of the plains, had joined the Horde after Thrall aided them against their centaur enemies. The Forsaken, the undead followers of Sylvanas Windrunner, were more recent additions, whose motivations and methods often seemed at odds with orcish values. And the Blood Elves, those elegant former High Elves who had suffered their own catastrophe, brought arcane magic and ancient wisdom to the coalition. Garrosh struggled to see these diverse peoples as true equals to the orcs. His upbringing among the Mag'har had emphasized orcish traditions and orcish strength, and while he could acknowledge the contributions of the other races, he could not quite bring himself to view them as genuine partners rather than useful allies. This attitude would prove increasingly problematic as his influence within the Horde grew, but in these early days, it remained largely unspoken, a bias that colored his perceptions without yet manifesting in policy. The streets of Orgrimmar buzzed with activity at all hours. Merchants hawked their wares in the Valley of Strength. Warriors trained in the Ring of Valor, and shamans communed with the elements in sacred spaces throughout the city. Garrosh walked among his people, observing their daily lives and beginning to form opinions about how the Horde should be led. He saw the strength in orcish arms, the determination in orcish eyes, and he believed that this strength was being squandered on Thrall's cautious policies. In the evenings, Garrosh would often find himself drawn to the monuments that honored the heroes of the Horde. The statue of his father, Grommash, stood as a reminder of both shame and redemption, of the terrible mistake that Grom had made and the heroic sacrifice that had undone it. Garrosh would stand before this statue for hours, silently communing with the memory of the father he had never truly known. He swore to himself that he would live up to Grom's legacy, that he would bring glory to the Hellscream name through deeds that would be remembered for generations. Garrosh's time as Thrall's advisor was marked by both promise and concern. His tactical instincts proved sound, and his passion for orcish glory inspired those around him. But he also displayed a hot-headedness that worried the more experienced leaders of the Horde. Where Thrall counseled patience and diplomacy, Garrosh advocated for aggressive action. Where Thrall sought to build bridges with the Alliance, Garrosh saw only enemies to be conquered. The philosophical differences between mentor and student became increasingly apparent, though at this early stage they remained manageable. One particularly notable incident occurred in the city of Dalaran, when Garrosh encountered Varian Rin, king of Stormwind, and his son Anduin. The tension between the two warriors was immediate and palpable, their mutual hostility barely contained by the neutral ground they stood upon. Garrosh saw in Varian everything he despised about the Alliance, the arrogance of a human king who believed himself superior to the orcish people. For his part, Varian recognized in Garrosh a dangerous element within the Horde, an orc who would not be content with peace if conquest remained an option. The confrontation ended without bloodshed, but it foreshadowed the conflicts that would eventually consume both the Horde and the Alliance. Garrosh carried the memory of that encounter with him, using it to fuel his conviction that the Alliance could never be trusted, that humans and orcs were destined to be enemies until one side or the other was destroyed. This belief would shape his decisions as Warchief in ways that Thrall never anticipated. The political landscape of Azeroth during this period was extraordinarily complex. The Third War had ended only a few years prior, and the wounds it had inflicted on both continents were still raw. The Burning Legion's invasion had demonstrated that the mortal races could work together when faced with existential threats, but peacetime had brought a return of old rivalries and suspicions. Theramore stood as a symbol of what cooperation could achieve, but it was an island of hope in an ocean of mutual distrust. Garrosh struggled to understand why Thrall seemed so committed to maintaining peace with creatures that had enslaved his people for generations. The internment camps, where orcs had been imprisoned after the Second War, were still fresh in the collective memory of the Horde. Many orcs bore scars from their time in captivity, and the stories of abuse and degradation were passed down to younger generations. From Garrosh's perspective, any peace with the humans was merely a temporary arrangement, a pause before the inevitable resumption of hostilities. The different perspectives on the war between the Horde and Alliance revealed fundamental philosophical differences between Thrall and Garrosh. Thrall saw the conflict as a product of misunderstanding and manipulation, believing that if both sides could overcome their prejudices, genuine coexistence was possible. He pointed to his own experiences, growing up among humans and learning that individuals on both sides were capable of honor and compassion. The war was not inevitable in Thrall's view, but a choice that could be unmade through patience and diplomacy. Garrosh, by contrast, viewed the conflict through the lens of Orcish warrior culture. To him, peace was something that had to be won through strength, not negotiated through weakness. The Alliance would only respect the Horde if they feared its military power, and any concessions made without corresponding demonstrations of strength would be seen as signs of vulnerability. His time among the Mag'har had taught him that orcs were at their best when they embraced their martial nature, and he saw Thrall's diplomacy as a betrayal of that essential identity. Thrall attempted to moderate Garrosh's more extreme tendencies through a combination of counsel and example. He brought the younger orc to diplomatic meetings, hoping to demonstrate that negotiation could achieve what warfare could not. He introduced Garrosh to the shamanic traditions that had once defined orcish spirituality, hoping that a connection to the elements would temper his aggressive nature. He paired Garrosh with experienced advisors who might guide him away from the worst impulses of his personality. But Garrosh proved resistant to these efforts. He saw Thrall's diplomacy as capitulation, his shamanism as distraction, his advisors as obstacles to be overcome rather than wisdom to be heeded. The pride that had replaced his former shame had crystallized into something harder and less flexible, a certainty in his own judgment that could not be shaken by the counsel of others. In his mind, he knew what the Horde needed, and anyone who disagreed was simply too weak or too foolish to understand. When the call came to march against the Lich King, Garrosh found his opportunity to prove himself on the battlefield. The frozen continent of Northrend became the stage for his military debut, and he seized this chance with both hands. Thrall appointed him to lead the Warsong Offensive, the primary Horde force in the Borean tundra, and Garrosh threw himself into this role with characteristic intensity. He established Warsong Hold as his base of operations, a mighty fortress that would serve as the command center for Horde operations in the region. High Overlord Varrock Saurfang was assigned as his second-in-command and chief advisor, and the relationship between these two orcs would prove to be both fruitful and fraught with tension. Saurfang was an elder warrior, a veteran of the First and Second Wars, who had seen firsthand the horrors that orcish bloodlust could create. He had watched the old Horde tear through the human kingdoms, had participated in atrocities that still haunted his dreams, and he had emerged from those experiences with a deep understanding of the importance of restraint and honor. He looked upon Garrosh's aggressive tactics with concern, seeing echoes of the old Horde's reckless violence. The arguments between Garrosh and Saurfang at Warsong Hold became legendary among the soldiers who served there. Garrosh would speak of the warrior spirit of the Horde, of how nothing could stop them if they simply embraced their martial nature and crushed all opposition. Saurfang would counter with talk of logistics, of supply lines, of the practical necessities that made military campaigns possible. When Garrosh dismissed these concerns, crushing markers on the map and declaring that they would simply take what they needed from alliance settlements, Saurfang would shake his head and remind him that there was more to war than killing. Despite their differences, the Northrend campaign under Garrosh's leadership proved remarkably successful. The Horde forces pushed deep into Scourge territory, winning victory after victory against the undead legions of the Lich King. Garrosh's courage in battle inspired his troops, and his willingness to lead from the front earned him their respect and loyalty. He was not merely a commander who gave orders from the safety of a fortress, but a warrior who fought alongside his soldiers, whose battle cry echoed across the frozen landscape as he charged into combat. The frozen wastes of Northrend presented challenges that would have broken lesser commanders. The cold was relentless, seeping into armor and bone, sapping the strength of even the hardiest warriors. The Scourge forces seemed endless, wave after wave of undead soldiers who felt no fear and knew no retreat. Supply lines stretched thin across hostile territory, requiring constant vigilance against both the undead and the Vrikul who called these lands home. Through all of these challenges, Garrosh drove his forces forward with an iron will and an unwavering belief in their ultimate victory. The battles themselves were the stuff of legend. At Warsong Hold's outer walls, Garrosh personally led a charge against a Scourge assault that would have overwhelmed the defenses. In the plains of the Borean tundra, he orchestrated a series of ambushes that decimated undead supply convoys. When the Alliance forces in the region attempted to claim resources that the Horde had targeted, Garrosh met their aggression with equal force, never allowing himself or his troops to be pushed aside by those he considered enemies. His relationship with the Alliance commanders in Northrend was particularly contentious. While both factions nominally shared the goal of defeating the Lich King, Garrosh refused to see the humans and their allies as partners in this endeavor. He viewed every interaction as a competition, every shared battlefield as an opportunity to demonstrate Orcish superiority. When Alliance forces achieved victories, Garrosh seethed with jealousy and drove his own troops harder to match their achievements. When the Horde claimed the glory, he made certain that everyone knew who was responsible for the triumph. The soldiers under Garrosh's command developed a fierce loyalty to their commander. They saw in him the embodiment of everything an Orcish warrior should be. He was strong, brave, and utterly committed to victory. He shared their hardships, ate the same rations, and faced the same dangers. When casualties occurred, Garrosh honored the fallen with ceremonies that emphasized their sacrifice and glory rather than merely mourning their loss. For these warriors, service under Garrosh was not merely a duty, but a privilege. Word of Garrosh's victories spread throughout the Horde, and he became something of a celebrity among his people. The son of Grommash Hellscream was proving himself worthy of his legendary bloodline, demonstrating the martial prowess that had made the Warsong clan famous. Even those who had initially viewed him with skepticism began to speak of him with respect, acknowledging that whatever his flaws might be, he was undeniably an effective military leader. When the campaign in Northrend concluded with the defeat of the Lich King, Garrosh returned to Orgrimmar as a conquering hero. The celebration that greeted his return was unlike anything the Horde had seen in years. Orcs lined the streets to cheer for the son of Hellscream, and the other races of the Horde joined in acknowledging his achievements. Thrall himself welcomed Garrosh home with words of praise, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the young warrior had found his place in the world. But even as the celebrations continued, forces beyond anyone's control were stirring that would soon thrust Garrosh into a position he had never sought and for which he was perhaps not ready. The victory over the Lich King was a watershed moment for both the Horde and the Alliance. The undead scourge had threatened to consume all life on Azeroth, and defeating them had required unprecedented cooperation between factions that had been at each other's throats for decades. Many hoped that this shared triumph might lead to lasting peace, that having fought together against a common enemy, the old hatreds might finally begin to heal. But others, including Garrosh, saw the victory differently, as proof that the Horde was powerful enough to stand alone, that they no longer needed to accommodate or compromise with those who had once been enemies. The campaign against the Lich King had tested Garrosh in ways that nothing in his previous experience had prepared him for. In Nagrand, his challenges had been personal, the internal struggle against shame and doubt. Northrend, he faced external challenges that demanded not only courage, but wisdom, not only strength, but strategy. The lessons he learned on the frozen continent would shape his approach to leadership for better and for worse. The Lich King himself represented everything that Garrosh despised about power wielded without honor. Arthas Menethil had been a prince who betrayed his own people, who murdered his father and destroyed his kingdom in pursuit of a power that ultimately consumed him. The undead scourge was a mockery of the warrior ideal, armies that felt no fear, not because of courage, but because they had been stripped of everything that made them people. To fight such an enemy was to confront the ultimate corruption of martial strength. Many of the soldiers who served under Garrosh in Northrend would form the core of his support base in the years to come. They had seen his bravery firsthand, had watched him stand against horrors that would have broken lesser orcs, and they believed in him with a fervor that bordered on devotion. When Garrosh later called upon these veterans to support his increasingly extreme policies, many followed without question, their loyalty forged in the crucible of a campaign where he had repeatedly proven himself worthy of their trust. The contrast between Garrosh's public success and his private uncertainties during this period is revealing. In front of his troops, he projected absolute confidence, the certainty of a warrior who knew that victory was inevitable if only they fought with sufficient determination. But in quieter moments, he confided to some that he feared he would never be able to fill his father's shoes, that the legacy of Grommash Hellscream was a standard he could never truly meet. This vulnerability, so carefully hidden, would eventually transform into the rigid arrogance that characterized his time as Warchief. The return from Northrend also brought Garrosh into closer contact with the political complexities of leading the Horde. In the field, his role had been clear: fight the enemy, win battles, claim victory. But in Orgrimmar, surrounded by politicians and diplomats, the challenges were different. He was expected to attend meetings, to listen to advisors, to weigh competing interests and make decisions that affected millions of lives. These were skills he had never developed, challenges for which his training had not prepared him. Thrall attempted to help Garrosh transition from military commander to political leader. He introduced him to the subtleties of Horde politics, explained the delicate balances that held the coalition together, and tried to impart the wisdom he had gained through years of leadership. But Garrosh was an impatient student. He had proven himself on the battlefield, and he saw no reason why leadership in peacetime should be any different. Strength had won the war. Strength would win the peace. The cataclysm began with little warning, as the corrupted dragon, Aspect Deathwing, burst forth from his hiding place in Deepholm and shattered the world. His emergence caused earthquakes and tidal waves across Azeroth, reshaping continents and destroying countless lives. The elementals, those primal spirits that the shamans had long communed with, became enraged and violent, turning against the mortal races they had once aided. Thrall, as both Warchief and a powerful shaman, was torn between his duties to the Horde and his responsibility to help address this elemental crisis. The devastation wrought by Deathwing was unlike anything Azeroth had experienced in living memory. The Barrens, which had been a single vast savanna, was torn in two by massive volcanic activity. Thousand Needles, once a desert of towering stone spires, was flooded when the ocean rushed in to fill newly created valleys. Ashara was reshaped by goblin engineering, and entire towns were swept away by the catastrophic changes to the landscape. The very fabric of reality seemed to be coming undone as the elements raged against each other and against the mortal races. For the Horde, the cataclysm posed challenges on every front. Supply lines were disrupted, settlements were destroyed, and the military resources that Garrosh had built up during the Northrend campaign were suddenly needed for disaster relief rather than conquest. The Alliance, despite suffering similar losses, seemed to view the chaos as an opportunity to press their advantage against the Horde, and border skirmishes intensified even as both factions struggled to survive the elemental upheaval. The Earthen Ring, a shamanic organization dedicated to maintaining balance between the elements, called upon Thrall to join their efforts to calm the enraged spirits. The threat posed by Deathwing and the elemental upheaval was too great to ignore, and Thrall's abilities as a shaman made him uniquely qualified to help address it. But this meant leaving the Horde without its Warchief at a time when strong leadership was desperately needed. Someone would have to take his place, at least temporarily, and guide the Horde through the chaos that the cataclysm had unleashed. Thrall's choice of successor would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the Horde. After much deliberation, he settled upon Garrosh Hellscream. The young orc's success in Northrend had demonstrated his military capabilities, and his passionate dedication to orcish values made him a natural rallying point for the Horde's warrior culture. Thrall believed that with proper guidance and the counsel of experienced advisors, Garrosh could maintain stability while the Warchief addressed the elemental crisis. When Thrall summoned Garrosh to Grommash Hold to inform him of this decision, the younger orc's reaction was unexpected. Rather than embracing the opportunity for power, Garrosh expressed reluctance. He saw himself as a warrior, not an administrator, and he doubted his ability to navigate the complex political landscape that the Warchief had to manage. The Horde was not merely an orcish organization, but a coalition of diverse races, each with their own interests and concerns, and Garrosh questioned whether he was equipped to balance these competing demands. But Thrall was insistent. He pressed Gorehowl, the legendary axe that had once belonged to Grommash Hellscream, into Garrosh's hands, telling him that he was more ready than he knew. The weight of his father's weapon seemed to settle something in Garrosh, and he accepted the responsibility that Thrall was placing upon him. He would serve as acting Warchief of the Horde, maintaining order until Thrall could return from his shamanic duties. Neither orc fully understood how that temporary appointment would transform into something far more permanent, or how the power it conveyed would change Garrosh in ways that would ultimately prove catastrophic. The early days of Garrosh's leadership were marked by uncertainty and adjustment. The various leaders of the Horde's member races viewed the new Warchief with varying degrees of skepticism and concern. Vol'jin, the Darkspear Troll chieftain, made no secret of his reservations about Garrosh's fitness for leadership. Cairn Bloodhoof, the aged and respected High Chieftain of the Tauren, watched the young orc carefully, hoping he would grow into his role, but worried about his aggressive tendencies. Even Sylvanas Windrunner, the Dark Lady of the Forsaken, assessed this new Warchief with cold calculation, measuring how his ascension might affect her own people and plans. Garrosh felt their scrutiny and resented it. He was Warchief now, appointed by Thrall himself, and he believed his authority should be respected without question. The political maneuvering and careful diplomacy that had characterized Thrall's leadership felt foreign to him, like weaknesses dressed up as virtues. He began to surround himself with advisors who shared his aggressive worldview, orcs who valued martial strength above all else, and who encouraged his inclination toward confrontation rather than compromise. The transition of power was complicated by the ongoing crisis. Garrosh had to deal with the aftermath of the cataclysm while simultaneously learning the responsibilities of his new position. He was forced to make decisions about resource allocation, military priorities, and diplomatic relationships without the experience or training that such decisions normally required. Every choice he made was scrutinized by the other Horde leaders, and every mistake was seized upon as evidence that Thrall had chosen poorly. One of Garrosh's first major decisions was to accelerate the Horde's military operations in contested territories. Where Thrall had sought a careful balance between expansion and consolidation, Garrosh saw only opportunities for conquest. He ordered aggressive campaigns in Ashenvale, pushing deeper into Night Elf territory and establishing new lumber operations to fuel the Horde's growing war machine. The Night Elves resisted fiercely, but Garrosh viewed their resistance as a challenge to be overcome rather than a warning to be heeded. The relationship between Garrosh and Sylvanas Windrunner was particularly complex. The Dark Lady had her own agenda, one that often diverged from the interests of the Horde as a whole, and Garrosh distrusted her from the beginning. He saw the Forsaken as useful tools at best, abominations at worst, and his disdain for them was barely concealed. When reports reached him of Forsaken forces using plague weapons against Alliance settlements, Garrosh traveled to Lordaeron to confront Sylvanas directly, warning her that such tactics were not acceptable under his leadership. Sylvanas responded to Garrosh's threats with cold politeness and continued to pursue her own objectives whenever she could do so without direct confrontation. The tension between them would persist throughout Garrosh's reign, a constant undercurrent of mutual suspicion and barely restrained hostility. Neither truly trusted the other, and both were willing to use the other when it served their purposes while waiting for the opportunity to be rid of them. The tensions between Garrosh and Cairn Bloodhoof proved particularly volatile. The Tauren chieftain was everything that Garrosh was not. Where Garrosh was young and impetuous, Cairn was ancient and wise. Where Garrosh saw strength in aggression, Cairn understood the power of patience and restraint. Their philosophical differences manifested in increasingly heated arguments, with Cairn openly criticizing decisions that he viewed as reckless, and Garrosh bristling at what he perceived as condescension from an elder who refused to accept the new order. The breaking point came when Cairn received reports of what appeared to be Horde forces attacking a group of druids in Ashenvale. Though these attackers were actually the Twilight's Hammer cult in disguise, Cairn believed that Garrosh had ordered the assault on neutral parties. Outraged by this apparent atrocity, the aged Tauren chieftain challenged Garrosh to a mak'gora, the traditional orcish duel of honor. Such a challenge, coming from a leader of Cairn's stature, could not be refused without tremendous loss of face. Garrosh accepted the challenge, though the decision weighed heavily upon him. Cairn was not an enemy he wished to destroy, but a fellow leader of the Horde, whose respect he had hoped to eventually earn. The mak'gora was set to take place in Orgrimmar, witnessed by representatives of all the Horde's races. Both combatants would be permitted one weapon and no armor, as tradition demanded, and the duel would be fought until one participant could no longer continue. In preparation for the duel, each combatant's weapon was to be blessed by a shaman. Cairn's Bloodhoof rune spear received the appropriate ritual blessings, but something far more sinister occurred with Garrosh's weapon. Mag'har Grimtotem, an elder crone of the Tauren Grimtotem tribe, who harbored deep resentment toward Cairn, saw in this duel an opportunity to advance her own ambitions. When she was asked to bless Gorehowl, she coated the blade not with ritual oils, but with a deadly poison, one that would weaken anyone it cut. The duel began with both combatants demonstrating why they had earned their positions of leadership. Despite his advanced age, Cairn fought with the skill and power that had made him legendary among his people. His strikes were precise and devastating, and as the combat continued, it became clear to many observers that the Tauren chieftain was actually gaining the upper hand. Garrosh was a formidable warrior, but Cairn's centuries of experience and natural Tauren strength made him a nearly unbeatable opponent. Then Gorehowl found its mark. A glancing blow opened a wound in Cairn's chest, not deep enough to be immediately fatal, but enough to introduce Magatha's poison into his bloodstream. The effect was almost instantaneous. Cairn's movements became sluggish, his vision blurred, and the strength that had defined him throughout his long life began to fade. He realized with horrible clarity that something was wrong, that he had been betrayed, but the poison had already done its work. When Garrosh's next strike came, the rune spear that had served Cairn for so long could not be raised to deflect it. Gorehowl's blade bit deep into the Tauren's neck and Cairn Bloodhoof fell dead before his body even hit the ground. Garrosh had won the mak'gora, but the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. He had not wanted to kill Cairn, not truly, and the manner of the Elder's fall, the sudden weakness that had overtaken him, raised questions that demanded answers. When the truth of Magatha's treachery was revealed, Garrosh's response demonstrated that whatever his flaws, he possessed a genuine sense of honor. His message to Magatha, when she sought his alliance after launching a coup to seize Thunderbluff, was devastating in its contempt. He wished her only a slow and painful death, and sent Horde forces to aid Cairn's son Bane in retaking the Tauren capital. But the damage had been done. Though Garrosh was innocent of deliberate treachery, Cairn Bloodhoof was dead by his hand, and the manner of his death had created a rift between the orcs and the Tauren that would never fully heal. Bane Bloodhoof, though he accepted Garrosh's innocence in the poisoning, could never look upon his father's killer without remembering the sight of Cairn falling to that tainted blade. The political fallout from the duel weakened Garrosh's position within the Horde and emboldened those who had always questioned his fitness for leadership. The aftermath of the mak'gora saw Magatha Grimtotem attempt to seize Thunderbluff for herself, using the chaos of Cairn's death to launch her long-planned coup. The Grimtotem tribe had always viewed themselves as the rightful rulers of the Tauren people, and Magatha had spent decades positioning herself for this moment. But she had miscalculated in one crucial aspect. She had assumed that Garrosh would support her claim to Thunderbluff, that the new Warchief would welcome an ally who had helped him win the duel against his rival. Garrosh's response to Magatha's overtures demonstrated that his sense of honor, while often warped by his pride, was not entirely absent. He refused to ally with someone who had used poison to corrupt a sacred duel, viewing her actions as a profound violation of Orcish tradition. His message to her was cold and uncompromising. He wished her a slow and painful death, and offered no support for her rule of Thunderbluff. When Bane Bloodhoof rallied loyal Tauren to retake their capital, Garrosh sent Horde forces to assist them, ensuring that Magatha's treachery would not be rewarded. The successful retaking of Thunderbluff did little to heal the wound that Cairn's death had created. The Tauren remained within the Horde, bound by treaties and alliances that predated Garrosh's ascension, but the relationship between Mulgore and Orgrimmar would never be the same. Every interaction between Garrosh and Bane carried the weight of that tragic duel, an unspoken tension that poisoned what should have been a partnership of equals. In the aftermath of Cairn's death, Garrosh seemed to embrace a harder, more uncompromising approach to leadership. Whether this was a response to the tragedy of the mak'gora, or simply the revelation of his true nature, remains a matter of debate among historians. What is clear is that the Garrosh who emerged from this period was more aggressive, more demanding, and more focused on demonstrating orcish strength than the one who had initially taken the mantle of Warchief. The psychological impact of killing Cairn should not be underestimated. Whatever Garrosh felt about the Tauren chieftain, he had not entered the mak'gora intending to kill an elder of the Horde. The discovery that he had won through treachery, even if that treachery was not his own, forced him to confront difficult questions about honor and legitimacy. Some speculate that his subsequent hardening was a defense mechanism, a way of avoiding the guilt that might otherwise have consumed him. Others suggest that Cairn's death simply removed the last voice that might have challenged Garrosh's more extreme tendencies. The Kor'kron, the elite guard of the Warchief, underwent a transformation under Garrosh's leadership. Where once they had been protectors of the Horde and its leaders, they increasingly became enforcers of Garrosh's will, loyal to him personally rather than to the institution of the Horde. He recruited heavily among orcs who shared his aggressive worldview, promoting those who demonstrated the kind of ruthlessness he valued and sidelining those who questioned his methods. The Kor'kron became his personal army, more loyal to the Warchief than to any other faction within the Horde. Orgrimmar itself changed during this period. New fortifications were added, the city's defenses expanded, and the atmosphere became more martial and less welcoming. Non-orc residents found themselves increasingly marginalized, their contributions undervalued, and their complaints ignored. The trolls of the Darkspear were pushed to the edges of the city. The Blood Elves were treated with barely concealed disdain, and even the goblins who had proven so useful were viewed as expendable resources rather than valued allies. The transformation of Orgrimmar under Garrosh's rule was not merely physical, but cultural. The city that Thrall had built as a refuge for all who followed the Horde banner was being remade into an orcish fortress where other races were tolerated at best. The markets that had once bustled with traders from all the member races now carried an undertone of tension as non-orcs moved through the streets with lowered eyes and careful steps. Children who had once played together, regardless of species, now heard whispers from their parents about who was truly welcome in Orgrimmar. The Kor'kron enforcers who patrolled the streets embodied this new reality. They were not merely guards, but a constant reminder of who held power in the city. Their checkpoints delayed travelers, their inspections humiliated merchants, and their presence at public gatherings ensured that any criticism of the Warchief remained unspoken. Those who questioned Garrosh's policies learned quickly to do so only in private, in whispers among trusted friends, never where Kor'kron ears might hear. The economy of the Horde shifted under Garrosh's leadership, redirecting resources from trade and development toward military production. Foundries that had once produced tools and farming equipment now churned out weapons and armor. Apprentices who might have learned crafts from master artisans were instead conscripted into training programs for soldiers. The entire society was being reoriented toward war, a permanent state of readiness that left little room for the peacetime pursuits that made life worth living. His conflicts with the Alliance intensified as Garrosh pushed for greater territorial expansion and more aggressive military campaigns. He saw the Horde's future in terms of conquest and domination, believing that only through strength could his people secure their place in Azeroth. The other races of the Horde, particularly the non-orcs, began to feel increasingly marginalized as Garrosh's vision of the future became more explicitly orc-centric. The coalition that Thrall had built through diplomacy and mutual respect was being reshaped into something that resembled the old Horde of the First and Second Wars. The city of Theramore became the focus of Garrosh's ambitions, and what he planned for it would shock even his own allies. Theramore was a human city on the eastern coast of Kalimdor Founded by Jaina Proudmoore as a haven for those who sought peace between the Alliance and the Horde. For years, it had represented the possibility of coexistence, a place where humans and orcs could interact without immediate violence. But its location made it strategically significant, and Garrosh saw in its destruction an opportunity to demonstrate the Horde's power and remove a potential staging ground for Alliance operations in Kalimdor. Garrosh had studied the Alliance military carefully, identifying their key commanders and understanding how they would respond to threats against their territories. He knew that a direct assault on Theramore would draw the cream of the Alliance military to its defense. These were not merely soldiers, but leaders whose loss would cripple Alliance operations for years to come. Generals, admirals, archmages, and heroes of a dozen campaigns would rush to protect this symbol of peaceful coexistence, never suspecting that their arrival was exactly what Garrosh wanted. The preparations for the attack were conducted with unusual secrecy. Garrosh trusted few with the full scope of his plans, understanding that not everyone in the Horde would approve of what he intended to do. The Kor'kron, his most loyal forces, were briefed on their roles. But even they did not know about the mana bomb until the final stages of the operation. Resources were gathered, troops were positioned, and the machinery of war was set in motion, while most of the Horde believed they were preparing for a conventional military campaign. The plan he devised was as cunning as it was brutal. Horde forces would launch an apparent frontal assault on Theramore, one that seemed designed to capture the city through conventional military means. But this assault was never intended to succeed. Its true purpose was to draw the greatest commanders of the Alliance to Theramore's defense, concentrating the enemy's leadership in a single location. Once this goal was achieved, the Azer's true weapon would be deployed. Working in secret, Garrosh had commissioned the creation of a mana bomb of unprecedented power. This weapon was empowered by the focusing iris, an artifact stolen from the blue dragonflight, which amplified its destructive potential to catastrophic levels. When the moment came, this bomb would be dropped on Theramore, annihilating not only the city, but all of the Alliance commanders who had gathered to defend it. In a single stroke, Garrosh intended to decapitate the Alliance military leadership and demonstrate that the Horde was willing to employ any means necessary to achieve victory. The attack unfolded largely according to plan. Alliance forces, including many of their most distinguished leaders, rushed to Theramore's defense. The Horde's assault was fierce enough to seem genuine, engaging the defenders in brutal combat while the mana bomb was prepared. Few among the Horde knew the truth of what was about to happen, and when vol'jin and Bane, Bloodhoof, learned of the plan, they were horrified. But by then, it was too late to stop what Garrosh had set in motion. The initial assault on Theramore was led by some of the Horde's most capable commanders. They besieged the city from land and sea, overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers and ferocity. The fighting was brutal, as urban combat always is, with every street and building becoming a battlefield. Alliance soldiers fought desperately to hold their positions, unaware that their very success in drawing reinforcements was serving Garrosh's true purpose. As the battle raged, more and more Alliance commanders arrived to coordinate the defense. Admiral Aubrey led ships into the harbor, while Archmage Ronan teleported in with his most powerful mages to provide magical support. General Marcus Jonathan brought veteran soldiers from Stormwind, and heroes from across the Alliance rushed to answer the call. Each new arrival made the eventual destruction more comprehensive, more devastating, exactly as Garrosh had planned. The Goblin engineers who had constructed the mana bomb loaded it onto an airship, positioning it high above the city where it would have maximum effect. They had calculated the blast radius precisely, ensuring that when the bomb fell, nothing within Theramore would survive. The focusing iris at its core would amplify the arcane energies to a degree that even the blue dragonflight had never attempted, turning the weapon into something that approached a force of nature in its destructive potential. The mana bomb fell upon Theramore with devastating effect. In a blinding flash of arcane energy, the city was simply erased from existence. Buildings, ships, people, all were vaporized in an instant as the focused magical energy tore through everything in its path. Thousands died in that moment, including Archmage Ronan, leader of the Kirin Tor, who sacrificed himself attempting to minimize the destruction. The crater that remained where Theramore had stood became a testament to the terrible power that Garrosh had been willing to unleash. Jaina Proudmoore survived only because Ronan had pushed her through a portal at the last moment, but the experience transformed her utterly. The woman who had dedicated her life to peace between the Alliance and Horde, who had defended orcs against her own father's vendetta, emerged from the destruction of Theramore with her hair turned white from the arcane energies and her heart turned cold with hatred. She nearly used the focusing iris to summon a massive tidal wave that would have drowned Orgrimmar and killed millions in revenge, stopped only by the intervention of the blue dragon Kalecgos, who helped her recognize that such an act would make her no better than Garrosh. The destruction of Theramore marked a point of no return for Garrosh Hellscream. Whatever reservations that other Horde leaders might have harbored about his leadership became active opposition after this atrocity. Vol'jin openly confronted Garrosh in Grommash Hold, telling the Warchief to his face that he would one day kill him. The Darkspear chieftain's words were treated as treason, and Garrosh ordered his assassination, but Vol'jin proved more difficult to kill than anticipated. The rift between the Warchief and the Troll leader would eventually grow into open rebellion. The confrontation between Vol'jin and Garrosh became one of the defining moments of this era in Horde history. The Troll chieftain had walked into Grommash Hold, past the guards who watched with uncertain eyes, and stood before the Warchief's throne with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to fear. Vol'jin had been a founding member of the new Horde, had stood beside Thrall when the orcs were still refugees fleeing internment camps, and he would not be intimidated by an upstart who had inherited rather than earned his position. The words Vol'jin spoke echoed through the halls of power. He told Garrosh that the Warchief had forgotten what the Horde was supposed to represent, that his actions at Theramore had dishonored every orc, troll, tauren, and Forsaken who wore the Horde banner. He prophesied that Garrosh would push the Horde to destruction, that his reign would end in fire and blood, and that when that day came, Vol'jin himself would be there to watch him fall. It was a declaration of war disguised as prophecy, and everyone present understood exactly what it meant. Garrosh's response was immediate and brutal. He declared vol'jin a traitor to the Horde and ordered his assassination. The Kor'kron agents he sent to kill the troll chieftain came close to succeeding, wounding vol'jin severely and forcing him into hiding. But the Darkspear were not so easily destroyed. vol'jin survived his wounds, nursed back to health by allies who shared his vision of what the Horde should be. From the shadows, he began to lay the groundwork for the rebellion that would eventually bring Garrosh down. The Blood Elves of Silvermoon also found themselves increasingly at odds with Garrosh's vision of the Horde. Lorthimer Theron, Regent Lord of Quel'Thalas, had watched the treatment of his people grow steadily worse under the new Warchief. Blood Elves were assigned the most dangerous missions, given the poorest supplies, and treated as expendable assets rather than valued allies. When Garrosh began to hint that the Blood Elves might be better off leaving the Horde entirely, many in Silvermoon began to wonder if he was right, though not in the way he intended. Secret negotiations began between Silvermoon and the Alliance, with Lorthamar exploring the possibility of bringing the Blood Elves back into alliance with the humans and their allies. The negotiations were complicated by the history between the two factions, particularly the attack on Dalaran that had resulted in the imprisonment or death of many Blood Elves. But the treatment they received under Garrosh made even these obstacles seem surmountable. The Horde was fracturing from within, and Garrosh seemed either unaware or unconcerned. When a new continent was discovered, shrouded in mists off the southern coast of the Eastern Kingdoms, Garrosh immediately recognized its potential significance. Pandaria had been hidden from the world for 10,000 years, its existence forgotten by most of Azeroth's inhabitants. The land was lush and beautiful, rich in resources, and home to a peaceful people called the Pandaren, who had developed a sophisticated civilization during their isolation. But Garrosh saw Pandaria not as a place of wonder to be explored with respect, but as a prize to be claimed for the Horde. The discovery of Pandaria came at a pivotal moment in the war between the Horde and Alliance. Both factions had been locked in escalating conflict since the destruction of Theramore, and both were desperate for any advantage they could find. When reports began filtering back of a hidden continent, filled with untapped resources and ancient secrets, the race to claim Pandaria began almost immediately. Ships were dispatched, soldiers were mobilized, and the stage was set for a new theater of warfare. The first Horde forces to arrive on Pandaria's shores encountered a civilization unlike any they had known. The Pandaren were peaceful by nature, but formidable when provoked, their monks practicing martial arts that could match any warrior in single combat. Their culture emphasized balance and harmony, concepts that seemed almost laughably naive to soldiers hardened by years of total war. Garrosh's commanders saw in the Pandaren a people ripe for domination, their peaceful ways a weakness that the Horde could exploit. But Pandaria was not as defenseless as it appeared. The continent harbored ancient secrets and powers that the outsiders could not understand. The Mogu, a race of stone warriors who had once ruled the land with an iron fist, had left behind artifacts of tremendous power. The Mantid, an insectoid species that periodically swarmed against the rest of Pandaria, represented a constant threat, and beneath the surface, something far more dangerous lay waiting, something that would ultimately prove to be Garrosh's greatest weapon and his ultimate downfall. The campaign in Pandaria began as a race for resources and territory, with Horde and Alliance forces establishing beachheads and competing for control of the continent's riches. Garrosh drove his forces relentlessly, establishing Domination Point as the Horde's primary base of operations and pushing ever deeper into Pandaran territory. But Pandaria was not merely a passive landscape waiting to be conquered. The land itself responded to the violence and negative emotions that the war brought, manifesting these dark energies as physical entities called Shah. The Shah were the lingering essence of an ancient evil, the last breath of an old god called Yasharj, who had been destroyed by the Titans in ages past. Each Isha embodied a negative emotion, such as fear, anger, hatred, violence, doubt, despair, and pride, and they fed upon these emotions when manifested by mortal beings. The war between the Horde and Alliance provided a feast for these entities, and they began to corrupt both sides of the conflict, driving soldiers to madness and spawning monsters that threatened all who entered Pandaria. The Pandaren who called this land home warned the invaders about the dangers of bringing war to their shores. They explained that negative emotions here had consequences unlike anywhere else on Azeroth, that anger and hatred would literally manifest as monsters if not controlled. The wisest among them, the monks and the Shadowpan who guarded against ancient evils, begged both factions to make peace, or at least to conduct their conflict elsewhere. But neither the Alliance nor the Horde were willing to abandon the resources and strategic advantages that Pandaria offered. For Garrosh, the warnings about the Shah represented an opportunity rather than a threat. Where others saw danger in these manifestations of negative emotion, he saw power waiting to be harnessed. If hatred and violence could create monsters, then perhaps those monsters could be controlled and directed against the Horde's enemies. If fear could be weaponized, then the Alliance would learn to fear the Horde as they never had before. His mind, always turning toward conquest and domination, began to formulate plans for how the Shah might serve his purposes. Garrosh dismissed warnings about the Shah as irrelevant distractions from the true purpose of the campaign. When he learned of an artifact called the Divine Bell, which the Mogu Empire had once used to imbue their warriors with tremendous power, he became obsessed with claiming it for the Horde. The search for the Divine Bell became a priority, and when Alliance forces beat the Horde to its location, Garrosh authorized a covert operation to steal it from Darnassus, the Night Elf capital. The Divine Bell itself was an artifact of tremendous historical and mystical significance. The Mogu had created it during their ancient empire, using it to transform ordinary warriors into beings of supernatural strength and resilience. The process required channeling specific emotional energies through the bell's resonance, and the Mogu had spent generations perfecting the techniques needed to produce consistent results. When the Mogu Empire fell, the Divine Bell was hidden away, its location lost to time until Garrosh's agents rediscovered it. The operation to recover the Divine Bell from Darnassus demonstrated both the reach of Garrosh's intelligence network and his willingness to conduct operations that risked open war with the Alliance. The Night Elf capital was protected by ancient wards and watchful sentinels, yet Horde agents managed to infiltrate the city, locate the artifact, and extract it without being caught until they were already making their escape. The audacity of the theft sent a clear message to the Alliance about Garrosh's capabilities and intentions. The experiments conducted in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms drew upon knowledge that Garrosh had gathered from various sources, including Mogu scrolls and the insights of corrupted Pandaren who had studied the Shah. He believed that with the proper techniques, the negative energy of the Shah could be harnessed just as the Mogu had harnessed it in ancient times. What he failed to understand was that the Mogu themselves had been creatures of stone given life by the Titans, beings whose essential nature was fundamentally different from that of mortal flesh and blood. The Kor'kron who volunteered for the Divine Bell experiments were among the most fanatical of Garrosh's followers. They believed absolutely in their Warchief's vision and were willing to risk their lives and their very souls for the promise of power that would make them invincible. When the experiments went wrong, when their comrades transformed into shrieking monstrosities that had to be put down like rabid animals, the survivors were shaken but not deterred. Such was the hold that Garrosh had over his most loyal followers. The Divine Bell was successfully recovered, and Garrosh immediately began experimenting with its power. His goal was to use the bell to infuse his Kor'kron elite guard with Shah energy, creating super soldiers who would be unstoppable in battle. But the experiments proved disastrous. The Shah energy was not a power that could be controlled or directed. Instead of empowering the Kor'kron, it corrupted them, transforming them into Shah-infested monsters who had to be destroyed by their own comrades. Prince Anduin Wrynn, son of the Alliance High King, had infiltrated Garrosh's base and witnessed these experiments. The young prince attempted to stop Garrosh, using a magical mallet to disrupt the Divine Bell's power and turn its destructive energy into harmony. Garrosh, enraged by this interference, struck at the bell itself, shattering it. The falling debris crushed Anduin beneath it, breaking his body and leaving him for dead. Garrosh left the scene laughing, believing he had killed the heir to Stormwind's throne, and struck a blow against the Alliance that would demoralize them for generations. Anduin survived, though his recovery would be long and painful. But the events in Pandaria had revealed something deeply disturbing about Garrosh's character. He was willing to experiment with powers he did not understand, to sacrifice his own soldiers in pursuit of greater strength, and to take joy in the suffering of his enemies. The Warchief, who had once sought to bring glory to the Horde, was becoming something darker, something that threatened not only the Alliance, but the Horde itself. As despite the failure of the Divine Bell experiments, Garrosh remained determined to master the Shah. His excavation teams, led by goblin engineers, began digging beneath the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, the sacred heart of Pandaren civilization. They were searching for the source of the Shah's power, and what they found was beyond anyone's expectations. Buried in a vault beneath the veil was the heart of Y'Sharj, the still beating heart of the old god whose death had created the Shah. This organ, preserved through millennia by dark magic, pulsed with unimaginable power. The discovery of the heart was a moment of terrible triumph for Garrosh. Y'Sharj had been one of the most powerful of the old gods, entities so ancient and malevolent that even the Titans had struggled to contain them. When the Titans had attempted to destroy Y'Sharj by physically tearing it from Azeroth, the wound left behind had nearly killed the world soul within the planet. The other old gods had been imprisoned rather than destroyed, but Y'Sharj had died, and its last breath had become the Shah that had plagued Pandaria ever since. And now its heart beat in Garrosh's hands. The power it contained was vast beyond measure, the concentrated essence of an entity that had challenged the Titans themselves. Other leaders might have recognized the danger of such an artifact, might have sought to destroy it or seal it away forever. But Garrosh saw only opportunity. If he could master this power, if he could bend the heart of Y'Sharj to his will, nothing in Azeroth could stand against him. The goblin excavation teams reported strange occurrences as they dug deeper beneath the veil. Workers went mad, babbling about voices in their heads before attacking their colleagues. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that defied explanation. The very earth seemed to resist their efforts, as though the land itself understood what they were trying to unearth. But Garrosh pushed them forward regardless, ordering them to dig faster, to go deeper, to break through whatever obstacles the ancient vault presented. The excavation site beneath the Veil of Eternal Blossoms became a place of dread and fascination. Garrosh's engineers constructed elaborate systems of pulleys and supports to safely extract whatever lay buried in the depths, but nothing could protect them from the psychic emanations of the buried artifact. Guards who stood watch at the pit's edge reported hearing whispers in languages they did not understand, promises of power and threats of destruction that seemed to come from the very darkness below. Some deserted their posts, fleeing into the countryside rather than spend another night near the excavation. The moment when the heart of Y'Sharj was finally uncovered must have been both triumphant and terrifying for those who witnessed it. Here was an organ that had continued to beat for millennia after its owner's death, preserved by magic so ancient that their workings could not be understood, let alone replicated. The sound it made was not the steady rhythm of a living heart, but something older and more disturbing, a pulse that seemed to resonate with the fear and desperation of all who heard it. Garrosh's willingness to claim such an artifact spoke to how far he had fallen from the values he had once professed to uphold. The warrior who had once dreamed of honorable combat and glorious victory was now willing to wield a weapon of corruption that violated everything the Horde was supposed to represent. The difference between Garrosh and Gul'dan, the warlock who had first corrupted the orcs, seemed increasingly difficult to articulate. Both had sought power at any cost. Both had been willing to sacrifice their own people for personal ambition. Garrosh claimed the heart for himself, seeing in it the weapon that would finally give him the power to crush all opposition. When Terran Zhu, the leader of the Shadowpan, attempted to stop him from corrupting the Veil, Garrosh defeated him in combat, leaving him impaled upon Gorehowl and using dismantled rails to choke him. He then submerged the heart of Y'Sharj in the sacred pools of the Val, watching as the dark power reacted with the holy waters to create a surge of Shah energy that devastated one of Pandaria's most sacred places. The corruption spread rapidly, transforming the beautiful Veil of Eternal Blossoms into a twisted nightmare called the Veil of Eternal Sorrows. The golden trees turned dark and withered, the crystalline waters became polluted and poisonous, and Shah manifestations emerged throughout the region. Garrosh had desecrated a place that the Pandaren had protected for 10,000 years, and in doing so, he had demonstrated that no tradition, no sacred space, no moral boundary would restrain his pursuit of power. The Horde could no longer pretend that Garrosh's actions represented their interests or values. Vol'jin's earlier threat was becoming reality as the Darkspear chieftain organized open resistance to the Warchief's authority. The Darkspear Rebellion, as it came to be called, drew support from across the Horde's member races. Tauren, who had never forgiven Garrosh for Cairn's death, joined readily. Blood Elves, who had been increasingly marginalized by Garrosh's orc-centric policies, threw their support behind the rebellion. Even some orcs, those who remembered the old Horde's atrocities and feared seeing them repeated, joined Vol'jin's cause. The formation of the rebellion was a dangerous undertaking. Vol'jin had to coordinate with leaders across the Horde while avoiding detection by Garrosh's Kor'kron enforcers. Secret meetings were held in hidden locations, messages were passed through trusted intermediaries, and the groundwork for the uprising was laid piece by piece. The risk of discovery was constant, and those who were caught faced torture and death at the hands of Garrosh's loyalists. Chen Stormstout, a wandering brewmaster of the Pandaren, played an unexpected role in the rebellion's success. He had befriended Vol'jin during the Troll chieftain's recovery from his wounds, and he used his connections among the Pandaren to gather intelligence and provide safe havens for rebel forces. The Pandaren themselves, outraged by what Garrosh had done to their sacred veil, offered what support they could without officially joining either faction in the conflict. The Shadowpan, despite their traditional neutrality, could not ignore the desecration of the Veil of Eternal Blossoms. Taran Zhu, who had nearly been killed by Garrosh, led his warriors in a campaign to contain the Shah corruption and oppose the forces of the true Horde wherever they threatened Pandaren lives. Their martial expertise and knowledge of Shah weaknesses proved invaluable to the combined forces that would eventually assault Orgrimmar. Garrosh responded to the rebellion by reorganizing the forces still loyal to him into what he called the true Horde. This was his vision of what the Horde should be, an organization dominated by orcs who valued strength and conquest above all else. The non-orcs who remained loyal were treated as second-class members at best, useful tools rather than true partners in Garrosh's vision of the future. Orgrimmar was transformed into a fortress, its gates guarded by Kor'kron enforcers who viewed any sign of dissent as treason worthy of death. The conflict between the True Horde and the Darkspear Rebellion escalated into what was effectively a civil war within the Horde. Vol'jin's forces liberated the Echo Isles from Kor'kron occupation and pushed toward Orgrimmar, gathering strength as they advanced. Thrall himself returned from his shamanic duties to join the rebellion, his presence legitimizing the uprising against the Warchief he had personally appointed. Bane Bloodhoof and his Tauren warriors added their strength to Vol'jin's cause, as did the Blood Elves under Lorthamar Theron, and eventually even the goblins of the Bilgewater Cartel when Garrosh refused to pay them for their services. The logistics of the Darkspear Rebellion were extraordinarily complex. Vol'jin had to coordinate forces spread across multiple continents while avoiding detection by Garrosh's extensive spy network. Messages had to be coded and delivered by trusted messengers, supply caches hidden in remote locations, and troop movements disguised as merchant caravans or hunting parties. Every rebel who was captured represented not just a loss of manpower, but a potential source of intelligence for the enemy, and the Kor'kron interrogators were notoriously effective at extracting information from prisoners. The ideological dimension of the rebellion was as important as its military aspects. Vol'jin and the other leaders had to articulate a vision of the Horde that was worth fighting for, a future that justified the terrible costs that the rebellion would demand. They spoke of returning to the values that Thrall had established when he founded the new Horde, of a coalition where every race was respected and valued, where honor meant more than mere strength. This vision resonated with those who remembered what the Horde had been before Garrosh twisted it into something unrecognizable. The decision to approach the Alliance for help was perhaps the most difficult Vol'jin ever made. The Horde and Alliance had been enemies for so long that the idea of fighting alongside humans and night elves against fellow orcs seemed almost inconceivable. But Vol'jin understood that pride had to be set aside in the face of existential necessity. Garrosh, with the heart of Y'Shaarj, was not merely a threat to the rebellion, but to everyone on Azeroth, and defeating him required resources that the rebels alone could not provide. King Varian Wryn's acceptance of the Alliance represented a significant gamble on his part as well. Many in the Alliance counseled that this was an opportunity to destroy the Horde entirely, to let the rebels and loyalists exhaust each other, and then sweep in to finish off the survivors. Varian chose instead to believe that a Horde led by Vol'jin would be a more reliable partner than one led by Garrosh, that peace between the factions was possible if only the right leaders were in place. It was a calculation that would be tested in the years to come, but Vol'jin recognized that even the combined forces of the rebellious Horde races could not match the power that Garrosh had accumulated in Orgrimmar. The heart of Y'Shaarj gave the Warchief access to powers that conventional military force could not overcome. To defeat Garrosh, the Darkspear Rebellion would need allies from an unexpected quarter. Vol'jin approached the Alliance with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He asked for their help in deposing Garrosh, promising that the Horde under new leadership would pursue a different path than the one the current Warchief had chosen. The Alliance leadership debated the proposal intensely. King Varian Wryn, whose son had been nearly killed by Garrosh, had every reason to want the Orc Warchief destroyed, but joining forces with other orcs, even rebellious ones, required setting aside years of enmity and distrust. In the end, the recognition that Garrosh with the heart of Y'Shaarj posed a threat to all of Azeroth, not merely the Alliance, convinced Varian to agree. Alliance and Horde forces would work together to bring down Garrosh Hellscream. The siege of Orgrimmar began with a coordinated assault on the Orcish capital. Alliance forces struck from the sea, landing on the beaches, while Darkspear Rebellion forces attacked from the landward side. The Kor'kron defenders fought with savage determination, but they were caught between two armies that had every reason to see them destroyed. The outer defenses of Orgrimmar fell one by one, and the combined forces pressed deeper into the city, fighting through districts that Garrosh had turned into killing grounds. The siege itself was one of the largest military operations in the history of Azeroth. Thousands of soldiers from both factions coordinated their efforts, pushing through the Valley of Strength, the Drag, and the various districts that made up the massive Orcish capital. Garrosh had prepared for this eventuality, transforming Orgrimmar into a fortress filled with traps, fortified positions, and fanatical defenders. The Kor'kron who remained loyal to him fought with a desperation born of knowing that their cause was lost, but refusing to surrender nonetheless. The champions who led the assault encountered boss after boss, each one a lieutenant of Garrosh who had to be defeated before the siege could progress. There were the dark shamans who had perverted their connection to the elements in service of Garrosh's agenda. There was the paragons of the Klaxi, insectoid beings who had allied with Garrosh in exchange for promises of power. There was General Nazgrim, once an honorable soldier who had served the Horde with distinction, but now found himself on the wrong side of history, his loyalty to his Warchief trumping his loyalty to what the Horde was supposed to represent. The fighting was brutal and costly, but the momentum was clearly against the true Horde. Garrosh's most loyal lieutenants fell in battle or surrendered as the siege progressed, and eventually the combined forces reached the Underhold, the massive underground complex beneath Grommash Hold, where Garrosh had made his final stronghold. Here, surrounded by the power of the heart of Y'Sharj, the Warchief prepared to make his last stand. The battle through the streets of Orgrimmar will be remembered as one of the bloodiest urban conflicts in the history of Azeroth. Every building had been fortified, every crossroads turned into a kill zone. Kor'kron snipers targeted officers and healers from elevated positions, while ground forces engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat in the narrow streets. The sounds of battle echoed off the metal spires of the city, a cacophony of screaming, steel on steel, and the roar of flames. As buildings burned around the combatants, the civilians of Orgrimmar, those who had not fled or been pressed into service by Garrosh's forces, cowered in basements and shelters as the fighting raged above them. Many of these were orcs who had simply been trying to live their lives when their city became a battleground, who bore no loyalty to Garrosh, but also had nowhere else to go. The liberating forces tried to minimize civilian casualties, but in the chaos of urban warfare, innocents inevitably fell. Their deaths would haunt those who survived long after the siege ended. The engineering corps of both the Alliance and Horde rebellion worked tirelessly to breach Garrosh's fortifications. Massive siege weapons had to be brought through the narrow gates, positioned under fire, and then used to demolish walls that had been reinforced with the dark iron of Blackrock foundries. Sappers crawled through sewers and tunnels, setting charges that would collapse defensive positions and create paths for infantry to advance. Every foot of ground was paid for in blood and sweat. Among the most memorable moments of the siege was the assault on the Underhold's outer defenses. The gates were guarded by war machines unlike anything the attackers had ever faced. Massive constructs powered by Shay energy that seemed almost alive in their malevolence. These weapons had to be destroyed before any advance could continue, and the battle against them claimed hundreds of lives. When the gates finally fell, the survivors pushed forward with a determination born of knowing that they could not stop now, that too much had been sacrificed to turn back. When the champions of the Horde and Alliance confronted Garrosh in his throne room, they found a being who had become something more and less than the orc they had once known. The power of the old god's heart flowed through him, and he wielded it with terrible effect. Thrall attempted to engage his former protege, hoping perhaps to reach whatever remained of the orc he had once believed in, but Garrosh incapacitated him with a blast of Shah energy. The former Warchief would have to be defeated by the combined efforts of the gathered champions. That Underhold itself was a testament to Garrosh's paranoia and his preparation for this final confrontation. Vast chambers had been carved from the stone beneath Orgrimmar, filled with weapons, supplies, and the industrial machinery needed to sustain a siege. The heart of Y'Sharj had been installed in the central chamber, its dark power flowing through conduits that extended throughout the complex. Garrosh had made this place his throne room, his fortress, and if necessary, his tomb. The champions who descended into the Underhold represented the best warriors that Azeroth had to offer. Alliance and Horde fought side by side, their old enmities set aside in the face of a threat that endangered everyone. Warriors and mages, priests and rogues, hunters and shamans, all of them united by a single purpose. Garrosh Hellscream had to be stopped, and they were the ones who would stop him. The confrontation with Garrosh began with words before it escalated to violence. The fallen Warchief ranted about his vision for the Horde, about the weakness of those who opposed him, about the inevitability of his victory. He showed no remorse for what he had done, no recognition that his actions had been wrong. In his mind, he was still the hero of his own story, fighting against enemies who simply could not understand the necessity of his methods. The battle against Garrosh was unlike any that had come before. At multiple points during the conflict, the power of Y'Sharj transported the combatants into vision realms, pocket dimensions shaped by Shah energy where they faced manifestations of the old god's malevolent will. Between these transitions, they fought Garrosh directly, watching as he absorbed more and more power from the heart, transforming himself into an avatar of Y'Sharj in a desperate bid for victory. But even this ultimate expression of corrupted power was not enough to overcome the determination of those who had come to end his reign. When the final blow fell, the power of Y'Sharj dissipated from Garrosh's exhausted body. He collapsed to the floor of his throne room, defeated but alive. Thrall, recovered from the earlier attack, stood over his fallen former protege with the Doomhammer raised, ready to deliver the killing stroke. The anger in Thrall's eyes spoke of betrayed trust, of a friend who had become a monster, of the weight of responsibility for having placed such a being in power. He was prepared to end Garrosh's life right there, to close this chapter of Orcish history with blood. But King Varian Wrynn stayed Thrall's hand. The High King of the Alliance declared that Garrosh's fate was not for any one person to decide. His crimes had affected all the peoples of Azeroth, Alliance and Horde alike, and justice demanded that he face trial for his actions. Taranju, the Shadowpan Lord whom Garrosh had nearly killed, stepped forward to take custody of the prisoner. The fallen Warchief would be transported to Pandaria to stand a trial before representatives of all the nations he had wronged. The trial of Garrosh Hellscream was intended to be a statement about justice and civilization, a demonstration that even the most powerful could be held accountable for their crimes. Representatives from across Azeroth gathered at the Temple of the White Tiger in Pandaria to witness the proceedings. The August Celestials, the divine beings who watched over Pandaria, would preside over the trial, ensuring that both prosecution and defense had the opportunity to present their cases fully. The choice of venue was significant. Pandaria had suffered perhaps more than any other land from Garrosh's actions, and the Pandaren had every right to demand that justice be served on their soil. The Temple of the White Tiger, dedicated to the Celestial of strength and courage, provided a neutral ground where both Alliance and Horde could gather without the tensions that would have accompanied a trial in either Stormwind or Orgrimmar. The august Celestials themselves, powerful beings who had watched over Pandaria for millennia, agreed to serve as judges, their wisdom and impartiality beyond question. The prosecution was led by Tyrande Whisperwind, High Priestess of Elune and leader of the Night Elves. She had been chosen for this role in part because of her centuries of experience with matters of law and justice, and in part because the Night Elves had suffered enormously from Garrosh's aggressive campaigns in Ashenvale. Her presentation of the evidence was meticulous and devastating, building a case that left little room for reasonable doubt about Garrosh's guilt. The defense, surprisingly, was undertaken by Bane Bloodhoof, who had agreed to represent Garrosh, despite having every personal reason to see him condemned. Bane believed that even the worst criminal deserved an advocate, and that a trial without a genuine defense would be nothing more than a show execution with extra steps. His role required him to find whatever mitigating circumstances might exist for Garrosh's actions, a task that tested his moral courage, even as it earned him criticism from those who wondered how he could defend his father's killer. To ensure that the testimony presented was accurate and could not be disputed, the bronze dragon Kairos Dormu provided an artifact called the Vision of Time. This device could project images of past events exactly as they had occurred, allowing the assembled witnesses to see for themselves the atrocities committed under Garrosh's command. The destruction of Theramore, the corruption of the Vale, the murder of innocents throughout Pandaria, all of these crimes would be shown in undeniable detail. The trial was documented in the novel War Crimes by Christie Golden, which explored not only Garrosh's actions, but the reactions of those who witnessed the evidence against him. For many in attendance, the visions forced them to relive traumatic memories and confront their own complicated feelings about guilt, justice, and the possibility of redemption. Jaina Proudmoore watched the destruction of Theramore replayed before her eyes. Bane Bloodhoof saw again his father's death. The trial became not merely a judgment of Garrosh, but a reckoning with the entire history of conflict between the Horde and Alliance. Throughout the proceedings, Garrosh showed no remorse. He defended his actions as necessary for the survival and glory of the Horde, arguing that the weak had no right to condemn the strong for doing what was necessary. His defiance in the face of overwhelming evidence only reinforced the sense that he had become something fundamentally different from the orc who had once led successful campaigns in Northrend. Whatever capacity for growth or change he might have once possessed seemed to have been burned away, replaced by a rigid certainty that could not be shaken by reason or evidence. The witnesses who came forward to testify against Garrosh represented a cross-section of those who had suffered under his rule. Night Elves spoke of the devastation in Ashenvale, where ancient forests had been leveled to fuel the Horde's war machine. Pandaren monks described the corruption of the Vale, their voices breaking as they recounted how a place of beauty and spiritual significance had been transformed into a nightmare. Former members of the Horde testified about the climate of fear that had pervaded Orgrimmar under Garrosh's leadership, about colleagues who had disappeared in the night, about the feeling that no one was safe from suspicion or accusation. The Celestials who served as judges listened to all testimony with divine patience, their ancient eyes seeing through deception and measuring truth with a precision that mortal judges could never match. Shuen the white tiger, Chi-Chi the red crane, Niu Zhao the black ox, and Yulon the jade serpent, these beings who had watched over Pandaria for 10,000 years, would determine whether justice could be achieved or whether some crimes were simply beyond the capacity of any court to address. Bane Bloodhoof's role as Garrosh's defender placed him in an impossible position. The Tauren chieftain had to find arguments to mitigate crimes that he himself found abhorrent, had to humanize a being who had killed his own father through treachery. Yet Bane believed that the integrity of justice demanded that even the worst accused receive a genuine defense, that a trial without advocacy was simply murder with better theater. His arguments focused not on denying Garrosh's actions, but on explaining the circumstances that had shaped him, the pressures he had faced, the failures of those who should have guided him. The prosecution, led by Tyrande, was relentless in its presentation of evidence. Image after image appeared in the air before the assembled witnesses, projected by the vision of time with crystal clarity. The mana bomb falling toward Theramore, the Shah energy erupting from the corrupted veil, soldiers dying in campaigns that served no purpose but to feed Garrosh's ambitions. Each vision brought gasps and cries from the audience, reminders of the personal cost of the accused's crimes. The trial was never destined to reach a verdict. Kairos Dormu, the bronze dragon who had provided the vision of time, had his own agenda that he had concealed from everyone involved. Using the power of the artifact, he created a portal that allowed him and Garrosh to escape from the temple before judgment could be rendered. In the chaos that followed, Garrosh killed his liberator and claimed the fragment of the vision of time for himself, having no interest in serving as anyone's puppet. The portal Kairos Dormu had created led to an alternate version of Draenor, one set approximately 35 years in the past. This was not the shattered outland that the dark portal connected to in the main timeline, but a complete and whole Draenor, the Orcish homeworld as it had been before the influence of the Burning Legion. For Garrosh, this represented an opportunity that he could never have imagined. Here was a world full of uncorrupted orcs, warriors who had not yet drunk the demon blood, who could be shaped into the army he needed to exact his revenge on Azeroth. The moment Garrosh set foot on this alternate Draenor, he knew that everything he had suffered, every defeat and humiliation, had led to this opportunity. The bronze dragon Kairos Dormu had intended to use Garrosh as a weapon, but the former Warchief had no intention of serving anyone ever again. When Kairos revealed his plan to create an infinite army by drawing orcs from countless alternate timelines, Garrosh saw only another master seeking to use him as a tool. He turned on the dragon with the ferocity that had made him famous, killing his liberator and claiming the fragment of the vision of time for himself. With Kairos dead, Garrosh was free to pursue his own agenda. He understood this alternate Draenor in ways that the bronze dragon never could have. He knew the orcish culture, knew the chieftains who led the various clans, knew the pressures and rivalries that shaped orcish society. Most importantly, he knew what was about to happen, the corruption that was coming if nothing was done to prevent it. This knowledge gave him power, leverage that he could use to reshape this world according to his vision. Garrosh found himself in Nagrand, the land where he had grown up in shame and isolation. But this was a Nagrand from before his birth, one where his father Grommash still led the Warsong clan as a chieftain free from demonic influence. Using the power of the vision of time, Garrosh showed Grommash visions of the future that awaited the orcs if they drank Mannoroth's blood. He revealed the blood curse, the failed invasions, the internment camps, all the suffering that the main timeline's orcs had endured as a consequence of their corruption. Convinced by these visions, Grommash rallied the orcish clans under a new banner. They would reject the demon blood that Gul'dan offered, would refuse to become pawns of the Burning Legion, and would instead forge their own destiny. But rather than seeking peace or isolation, this united orcish nation would build weapons of war unlike anything Draenor had ever seen. Garrosh shared the technology that the goblins of Azeroth had developed, the siege engines and iron stars and military innovations that would transform the orcish clans into the Iron Horde. The formation of the Iron Horde was a remarkable achievement, bringing together clans that had often been rivals or outright enemies. The Warsong, the Blackrock, the Shattered Hand, the Burning Blade, the Bleeding Hollow, and others, all united under this banner of the Iron Horde, with Garrosh Hellscream as their supreme leader. Garrosh served as the power behind the throne, providing technological expertise and strategic guidance while allowing his father to take the glory of leadership. It was a strange dynamic, a son manipulating events from the shadows while his father claimed the public role of warlord. The industrial capacity of the Iron Horde was staggering. Massive foundries were constructed, churning out weapons and armor in quantities that the old Horde could never have imagined. Iron stars, massive spherical siege weapons that could devastate enemy formations, rolled off production lines. Warships were built, equipped with cannons and armored plating that made them nearly invincible against conventional attack. The orcs of this alternate Draenor embraced technology with a fervor that surprised even Garrosh, their natural aggression channeled into industrial production as well as warfare. The construction of a new, dark portal was the crowning achievement of the Iron Horde's industrial might. Using the souls of captured Draenei and the power of imprisoned elementals, the portal was connected to the Dark Portal in Azeroth's blasted lands. When it activated, it created a gateway not to the ruined Outland, but to the prime timeline's Azeroth, allowing the Iron Horde to invade the world that had defeated its corrupted predecessors. The Dark Portal was reconstructed in this alternate Draenor, but instead of leading to the Outland of the main timeline, it was connected directly to the original Dark Portal in the Blasted Lands. When the portal activated, the Iron Horde poured through into Azeroth, launching an invasion that threatened to succeed where the demon-corrupted Horde had failed. These orcs were stronger, better equipped, and fighting with the unified purpose that Garrosh had instilled in them through his visions of what their corruption would have brought. The war against the Iron Horde forced the heroes of Azeroth to travel to this alternate Draenor, establishing garrisons and fighting to stop the invasion at its source. Throughout the campaign, Garrosh served as warlord of the Warsong clan, directing their efforts from his position of power within the Iron Horde hierarchy. He had achieved a twisted version of his dreams, leading an orcish force that embodied the martial pride and strength he had always valued, free from the demonic taint that had corrupted his father's generation. The initial invasion of Azeroth was devastating. Iron Horde forces swept through the blasted lands, overwhelming the Alliance and Horde defenders who had maintained a watch on the Dark Portal. The technological superiority of the Iron Horde was immediately apparent, as their cannons and siege weapons tore through fortifications that had stood for decades. For a moment, it seemed as though history might repeat itself, with an orcish invasion threatening to sweep across the eastern kingdoms, just as the demon-corrupted Horde had done generations before. But Azeroth was better prepared for this threat than it had been for the first invasion. The combined forces of the Alliance and Horde rallied quickly, sending their greatest heroes through the portal to take the fight to the Iron Horde's doorstep. They established footholds on alternate Draenor, building garrisons that would serve as bases of operations for the campaign against Garrosh's forces. The war that followed was long and bloody, fought across the varied landscapes of a world that many had only heard about in stories. Garrosh watched from his stronghold as his carefully laid plans began to unravel. The heroes of Azeroth proved more resilient than he had anticipated, adapting to the threats of alternate Draenor and forging alliances with local factions who opposed the Iron Horde. The Draenei, whose ancestors had fled to Azeroth to escape orcish persecution, were powerful allies against Garrosh's forces. Even some orcs, those who saw through the propaganda of the Iron Horde and recognized that Garrosh's path led only to destruction, joined the resistance. But the heroes of Azeroth proved equal to the challenge. Working with local allies, including a version of the Draenei prophet Velen and orcs who rejected Garrosh's vision, they pushed back against the Iron Horde's advance. The warlords who commanded the Iron Horde fell one by one, their fortresses crumbled, their armies scattered. Eventually, the conflict came to a head in Nagrand, where Garrosh had first learned the truth of his father's sacrifice and where his new empire would meet its end. The fall of the Iron Horde's warlords was a campaign that unfolded over months of brutal conflict. Kargath Bladefist, chieftain of the Shattered Hand, fell in the arena of Highmaul where he had once seemed invincible. Blackhand the Destroyer, whose foundry had produced the weapons of the Iron Horde, was defeated in his own fortress amid rivers of molten metal. Kilrog Dedas, who had seen his own death in a vision and embraced it, met that fate at the hands of the champions who had come from another world to end the Iron Horde's ambitions. Each victory came at tremendous cost. The soldiers who fought against the Iron Horde were far from home, dependent on supply lines that stretched across dimensional barriers. They faced an enemy that was technologically advanced and utterly ruthless, willing to employ any weapon and sacrifice any number of troops to achieve their objectives. The war against the Iron Horde was not merely a military campaign, but a struggle for the very survival of Azeroth as a world free from orcish conquest. The relationship between Garrosh and his father Grommash during this period was complex and often strained. Grommash was a proud chieftain who had united the clans through force of personality and martial prowess, not through the manipulations of a son from another timeline. As the war against Azeroth's champions went increasingly poorly, tensions between the two Hellscreams grew. Grommash began to question whether his son's guidance had truly served the Orcish people or merely dragged them into a war they could not win. The eventual betrayal of the Iron Horde by the Burning Legion, when the warlock Gul'dan seized power and opened the door to demonic corruption, must have seemed to Garrosh like a terrible joke played by fate. He had traveled to an alternate timeline specifically to prevent the orcs from being corrupted by demons, had shared his knowledge and technology to build an empire free from demonic influence, and in the end, the demons had found another path to corruption. Everything he had sacrificed, everything he had built, had led only to the same outcome he had tried to prevent. Thrall had followed Garrosh to alternate Draenor, determined to end the threat that his former protege posed once and for all. The former Warchief carried the weight of responsibility for having placed Garrosh in power, for having believed that the son of Hellscream could lead the Horde wisely. He had watched from a distance as Garrosh committed atrocity after atrocity, and he had come to the conclusion that this corruption could only be ended through personal confrontation. The two orcs met at the Stones of Prophecy, a place of spiritual significance in Nagrand, where visions of the future were said to manifest. Garrosh was preparing to execute Durotan in the player character when Thrall arrived, challenging him to a mak'gora to save their lives. The traditional duel of honor was fitting for the end of this conflict, echoing the mak'gora that had killed Cairn Bloodhoof so many years before and connecting the conclusion of Garrosh's story to its tragic middle chapter. Garrosh accepted the challenge with savage joy. Throughout the duel, he gave voice to the resentments that had festered within him since his fall from power. He blamed Thrall for his failures, arguing that the former Warchief had placed him in a position he was not prepared for and then abandoned him to face challenges alone. It was Thrall's fault, Garrosh claimed, that things had gone wrong. Thrall's fault for appointing him Warchief. Thrall's fault for leaving to play shaman while the Horde needed true leadership. Thrall's response was blunt and uncompromising. He acknowledged that he had made Garrosh Warchief, but the choices that followed were Garrosh's own. The destruction of Theramore, the corruption of the Vale, the atrocities committed throughout Pandaria, these were not the inevitable consequences of difficult circumstances, but the deliberate actions of an orc who had chosen power over honor. Garrosh had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. The duel was fierce and brutal, with both combatants demonstrating the martial prowess that made them legendary among their people. Garrosh initially had the upper hand, his rage giving him strength and his desperation making him reckless in his attacks. But Thrall was not merely a warrior. He was also a shaman, connected to the elemental spirits in a way that transcended ordinary combat. And when he called upon these powers, the balance of the fight shifted. The exchange of blows echoed across the Stones of Prophecy, each strike carrying the weight of years of conflict and betrayal. Garrosh fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose, his massive frame crashing against Thrall again and again. He landed powerful blows that would have felled lesser opponents, his rage manifesting in every swing of his weapon. For a moment, it seemed as though raw fury might overcome shamanic power. But Thrall was not merely defending himself. He was waiting, watching, looking for the moment when Garrosh's aggression would leave him vulnerable. When that moment came, Thrall did not hesitate. He reached out to the elements that had been his allies throughout his life, calling upon powers that transcended the physical combat in which they were engaged. The earth and sky responded to his summons, recognizing in Thrall a champion who had served them faithfully for decades. The elements answered Thrall's call. The earth rose to grasp Garrosh, restraining his movements. Lightning gathered in the sky above them, responding to Thrall's summoning. With a final declaration that Garrosh had brought this fate upon himself, Thrall called down a bolt of lightning that struck the restrained orc with lethal force. Garrosh Hellscream, son of Grommash, former Warchief of the Horde, died in the same land where he had once learned of his father's heroic sacrifice. The manner of Garrosh's death would become a source of controversy among those who witnessed it and those who learned of it later. Traditional mak'gora rules called for each combatant to use a single weapon, and the elements that Thrall had summoned went beyond what many considered acceptable within the duel's parameters. Some argued that Thrall had cheated, that he had used powers that violated the spirit of the mak'gora, even if they did not technically break its rules. The moral ambiguity of Garrosh's death reflected the moral ambiguity of his entire story, a narrative in which right and wrong were often difficult to distinguish. For Thrall, the killing of Garrosh came with a profound spiritual cost. In the aftermath of the mak'gora, he found that his connection to the elements had weakened significantly. The spirits that had once answered his call so readily now seemed distant and reluctant, and some speculated that this was because he had used them in a manner that violated the sacred nature of the duel. As Thrall had killed a fellow orc in a mak'gora using shamanic powers, and the elements themselves seemed to judge him for this action. The question of whether Thrall acted honorably in the mak'gora has been debated endlessly by those who study Orcish tradition. Some argue that a shaman's connection to the elements is as much a part of them as a warrior's strength or a mage's arcane knowledge, and that using these powers in combat is no different than using any other skill. Others contend that the mak'gora was intended as a test of personal martial ability, and that calling upon external forces violated the spirit of the tradition, even if it did not technically break its rules. The elements themselves seem to take a position on this question through their subsequent withdrawal from Thrall. For years afterward, the former Warchief found his shamanic abilities diminished. His calls to the spirits met with silence or reluctance, where once they had answered eagerly. This spiritual crisis forced Thrall to question whether his anger toward Garrosh had corrupted the sacred bond between shaman and element, whether in seeking to destroy his former protege, he had damaged something fundamental within himself. The death of Garrosh also raised questions about justice and closure that would never be fully answered. The trial in Pandaria had been interrupted before a verdict could be rendered, and the mak'gora was a personal confrontation rather than an act of organized justice. Garrosh died because Thrall killed him, not because any court or authority declared that he should die. For some, this was satisfying. The the clean resolution of one orc defeating another in honorable combat. For others, it represented a failure of the systems that should have held Garrosh accountable for his crimes. The witnesses to the mak'gora would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. They had seen two of the most powerful orcs in history clash in a battle that would determine the fate of two worlds. They had watched Garrosh fall, had heard Thrall's final condemnation, had felt the weight of an era ending in a flash of elemental fury. The son of Hellscream, who had risen from shame to become Warchief and then fallen to become a tyrant, had met his end in the land of his father's birth. Death, however, was not the end of Garrosh Hellscream's story. In the cosmic order of the Warcraft universe, souls do not simply cease to exist when their mortal bodies die. Instead, they are drawn into the Shadowlands, the realm of the afterlife, where they are sorted into appropriate domains based on their nature and actions in life. The machinery of death, operated by the mysterious Arbiter, would assign each soul to a realm that matched its fundamental character. The Shadowlands is a vast realm divided into multiple domains, each designed to serve a specific purpose in the cosmic cycle of life and death. Some souls go to Bastion, where they become the noble Kyrian who ferry the dead to their final destinations. Others go to Ardenweld, the forest realm where nature's spirits are restored before being reborn. Maldraxxus serves as the Shadowlands' military might, while Revendreth exists to redeem those souls whose pride prevented them from finding peace. And for those who are truly irredeemable, there is the Maw, the bottomless prison from which there is no escape. The nature of the Shadowlands defies easy mortal comprehension. It is not simply an afterlife in the conventional sense, but a vast cosmic machinery designed to process and recycle the anima, the soul stuff, of all beings who pass from the mortal realm. The various realms that compose the Shadowlands each serve a purpose in this grand cycle, taking souls and transforming them, preparing them for whatever comes next in the eternal dance of existence and oblivion. For a being like Garrosh, whose life had been so dominated by war and ambition, the peaceful eternities of Bastion or the nurturing restoration of Ardenweld were never possibilities. His soul was too marked by the choices he had made, too saturated with the consequences of his actions to find rest in realms designed for gentler spirits. The question was not whether he would be punished, but rather what form that punishment would take and whether any spark of redemption might be found within him. The architecture of Revendreth reflected its purpose with Gothic grandeur. Towering spires reached toward a sky that never brightened beyond twilight, casting long shadows over cobblestone streets that wound between mansions and cathedrals. The Venthyr who inhabited this realm were creatures of refined cruelty, aristocrats of suffering who had elevated the extraction of anima into an art form. They dressed in the finest garments, spoke with cultured accents, and conducted their tortures with the precision of surgeons and the appreciation of connoisseurs. When Garrosh's soul arrived in the Shadowlands, the Arbiter, that ancient being who served as judge and sorter of all souls, made her determination quickly. There was no doubt about where the former Warchief belonged. His crimes in life had been extensive and unrepentant, his pride vast and unyielding. He would be sent to Revendreth, where the Venthyr would attempt to strip away his arrogance and prepare him for whatever fate awaited those who had sinned so greatly. Garrosh's soul was sent to Revendreth, the realm of pride and atonement. This Gothic domain, ruled by the vampiric Venthyr, was designed to strip away the pride of souls who had been guilty of arrogance in life, preparing them either for redemption or for final damnation in the Maw. The Venthyr fed upon the anima, the spiritual energy, of their charges, and souls like Garrosh, who had lived lives of exceptional pride and ambition, were particularly valuable sources of this sustenance. In Revendreth, Garrosh was classified as what the Venthyr called an old reliable, a soul whose pride was so vast and so resistant to redemption that it could be harvested indefinitely. He was not given the opportunities for atonement that souls like Kael'thas Sunstrider received, perhaps because the Venthyr recognized that his pride was not merely a character flaw, but a fundamental aspect of his being that could never be truly excised. Instead, he was chained in dungeons deep beneath the spires of Revendreth, his anima continuously drained to fuel the realm's operations. The animated short afterlives, Revendreth, released prior to the Shadowlands expansion, revealed Garrosh's fate to players. In this cinematic, we saw him bound and tortured, his spirit unbroken despite the constant drain upon his essence. The Venthyr Inquisitors who attended him marveled at his resistance, at the inexhaustible nature of his pride, and treated him as a curiosity as much as a resource. Garrosh had become exactly what the realm needed, a soul that would provide anima for eternity without ever achieving the redemption that would release him to a better fate. When the events of Shadowlands unfolded and the Maw began to consume souls that should have been sent to other realms, Garrosh was among those transferred to this prison of the damned. The Maw was the realm of eternal damnation, a place where the most irredeemable souls were sent to suffer forever, stripped of any hope of escape or redemption. For Garrosh, this transfer might have seemed like merely an exchange of one form of torment for another, but the Maw offered something that Revendreth had not. In the Maw, Garrosh encountered forces that sought to use him for their own purposes. The Jailer, the ancient being who ruled this realm of damnation, collected souls of power for his plans, and Garrosh's strength and ferocity made him a potentially valuable asset. The Jailer had assembled many powerful souls to serve his schemes, from fallen leaders to corrupted heroes, and Garrosh seemed like an ideal candidate for recruitment. But even in the face of this cosmic evil, even when offered power or relief from torment in exchange for service, Garrosh refused to submit. His pride, which had been his downfall in life, became a form of resistance in death. He would not bow to any master, would not serve any cause but his own, would not allow any power to claim dominion over him. The Jailer could offer him armies, could promise him vengeance against those who had wronged him, could dangle the possibility of escape from eternal torment. But Garrosh rejected every offer with the same contemptuous defiance he had shown throughout his life. The irony of this final stand was not lost on those who observed it. Garrosh's pride had been the quality that turned him from a capable leader into a tyrant, that had blinded him to the harm he was causing and the allies he was losing. It was pride that had made him destroy Theramore, corrupt the Veil, and ultimately tear the Horde apart in pursuit of his vision of orcish supremacy. Yet in the Maw, that same pride became his only remaining source of resistance, the quality that prevented even the most powerful beings in the Shadowlands from claiming him as their tool. This defiance ultimately led to Garrosh's complete destruction. Rather than become a tool of the jailer, rather than submit to the forces that sought to use him, Garrosh chose to destroy himself utterly. In an act of final, desperate rage, he turned his remaining power against himself, shattering his own soul rather than allowing it to be claimed by another. The orc who had refused to accept any limitation on his ambition in life carried that refusal into death, preferring absolute annihilation to the surrender of his autonomy. There is a tragic grandeur in this final act of defiance. Garrosh Hellscream, who had done terrible things in pursuit of power, who had corrupted sacred places and murdered innocents, who had torn the Horde apart with his ambition, in the end chose destruction rather than submission. His pride was both his greatest flaw and his final weapon, the characteristic that had led him to ruin, and the quality that prevented even the forces of cosmic evil from claiming him as their servant. Beyond the games themselves, Garrosh Hellscream has become one of the most recognizable and beloved characters in the Warcraft franchise. His appearances in other Blizzard games have introduced him to players who might never have experienced his story in World of Warcraft, and his distinctive design and personality have made him an icon of the Horde. The community response to Garrosh has been remarkably diverse, reflecting the complexity of his character. Some players despise him for his atrocities, viewing him as an irredeemable villain who represents everything wrong with the Horde's warrior culture, taken to extremes. Others see him as a tragic figure, someone whose potential was wasted through a combination of bad luck and poor mentorship. Still others appreciate him precisely because of his complexity, finding in his story a nuanced exploration of how good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes. The Siege of Orgrimmar raid, which served as the climax of the Mists of Pandaria expansion, remains one of the most memorable instances in World of Warcraft's history. Players spent months fighting through the streets of the Horde capital, defeating Garrosh's lieutenants one by one, before finally confronting the fallen Warchief himself. The encounter was mechanically challenging and narratively satisfying, providing a fitting conclusion to a story that had been building across multiple expansions. Fan discussions about Garrosh continue to this day, debating everything from whether his actions could have been prevented to whether his punishment in the Shadowlands was proportionate to his crimes. He appears regularly in fan art, fan fiction, and community discussions, a testament to the lasting impact his character has had on the World of Warcraft community. Few villains in gaming have inspired such passionate and divided opinions. In Hearthstone, Blizzard's digital card game, Garrosh serves as the representative of the warrior class. This was one of the earliest design decisions made for the game, and Garrosh was actually the first character designed for Hearthstone, predating even the game's core mechanics. His voice lines and personality in the game reflect the aggressive, confrontational nature that defined him in World of Warcraft, and players who choose the warrior class find themselves commanding armies and weapons in Garrosh's name. The Book of Heroes solo content in Hearthstone includes a chapter dedicated to Garrosh, allowing players to experience key moments from his story in card game form. From his shame-filled youth in Garadar to his rise as Warchief and eventual fall, The Book of Heroes presents Garrosh's narrative through a series of increasingly challenging encounters. Players control Garrosh as he battles through his history, making decisions that reflect the choices that shaped his character in the main games. Garrosh's appearance as the warrior class representative has spawned multiple alternate hero skins, including Garrosh of Might, which depicts him wearing the iconic battle gear of Might armor set and wielding an Arcanite Reaper. These cosmetic variations allow players to customize their Hearthstone experience while still channeling the power and ferocity that Garrosh represents. In the Mercenaries game mode, Garrosh appears as a playable character with his own abilities and upgrade paths, allowing players to build teams that feature the Son of Hellscream alongside other Warcraft legends. In Heroes of the Storm, Blizzard's crossover multiplayer online battle arena, Garrosh appeared as a playable tank hero in August 2017. His kit in that game emphasizes his brutal fighting style and ability to dominate opponents through sheer force. His trait, Armor Up, makes him more difficult to kill as he takes damage, reflecting his refusal to yield even when wounded. His abilities allow him to pull enemies toward him, slam the ground to stun opponents, and throw enemy heroes into his allies like weapons. The characterization of Garrosh in Heroes of the Storm maintains the aggressive, domineering personality that defined him in World of Warcraft. His voice lines are filled with challenges and insults, and his interactions with other heroes often reference the complex web of relationships he had with various Warcraft characters. When facing Thrall, he speaks of betrayal and broken trust. When encountering Alliance heroes, he threatens destruction. Even in a game focused on team combat rather than narrative, Garrosh's personality shines through clearly. The cultural impact of Garrosh extends beyond his gameplay appearances. His famous quote from the Burning Crusade expansion, delivered when players encounter him in Nagrand before he has overcome his shame, became a meme that far outlasted its original context. The phrase, merely a setback, while actually spoken by Kael'thas Sunstrider, became associated with Garrosh due to fan confusion and the similar circumstances of their respective returns from apparent defeat. This conflation speaks to how deeply both characters embedded themselves in player consciousness. Garrosh's character design, with his distinctive jaw structure, elaborate armor, and massive frame, has made him instantly recognizable even to those unfamiliar with his story. He appears in Warcraft merchandise, from action figures to art prints, and his image has been used in promotional materials for both World of Warcraft and its spin-off games. The Son of Hellscream has become an icon of the Horde, representing both its martial strength and its capacity for self-destruction. The story of Garrosh Hellscream raises profound questions about leadership, legacy, and the nature of corruption. Was he a victim of circumstances, an orc placed in a position he was not prepared for and abandoned by those who should have guided him? Or was he fundamentally flawed from the beginning, his later atrocities merely the revelation of a nature that had always been present beneath the surface? The answer, as with most complex characters, lies somewhere between these extremes. The debate over Garrosh's legacy continues among scholars and historians of Azeroth. Some argue that he was doomed from the start, that the combination of his father's reputation and his own psychological damage made his eventual corruption inevitable. They point to his behavior in Nagrand, to the depression and self-loathing that characterized his youth, and suggest that these wounds were never truly healed, but merely covered over by the pride that replaced them. The transformation that Thrall triggered was not a cure, but a different kind of sickness, trading one form of dysfunction for another. Others take a more sympathetic view, arguing that Garrosh was placed in an impossible position and failed to receive the support he needed to succeed. They point out that Thrall left him virtually alone to deal with the Cataclysm, one of the most devastating events in Azeroth's history, while the former Warchief pursued his shamanic calling. The advisors who should have guided Garrosh either opposed him from the start, like vol'jin, or had their own agendas, like Sylvanas. Without proper mentorship or a genuine support network, Garrosh's worst impulses went unchecked. The comparison between Garrosh and other Horde leaders is instructive. Thrall, who came to power under similarly challenging circumstances, had the benefit of mentors who believed in him and allies who remained loyal through difficult times. Cairn Bloodhoof had centuries of experience and the wisdom of his people to draw upon. vol'jin had the spiritual guidance of the Loa and the support of the Darkspear tribe. Garrosh had none of these advantages. He was promoted beyond his capabilities and left to sink or swim, and when he began to sink, those who should have thrown him a lifeline instead waited to watch him drown. Thrall's decision to appoint Garrosh as Warchief remains controversial among those who study Orcish history. The former Warchief saw in Garrosh qualities that he believed could serve the Horde well, but he failed to recognize or adequately address the young orcs' limitations. Garrosh himself made this accusation in their final confrontation, and while Thrall rightly pointed out that Garrosh's choices were his own, there is truth in the observation that better mentorship might have led to different outcomes. The transformation of Garrosh from a melancholic, shame-filled young orc to a proud and ambitious leader, to a tyrant willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals, can be traced through the events of his story. Each step along this path seemed reasonable from his perspective, each escalation justified by the challenges he faced. The destruction of Theramore was a military strike against an enemy, the corruption of the Veil, an attempt to gain power necessary to protect his people, the formation of the Iron Horde, a final effort to create the Orcish nation he had always dreamed of. But perspective is not justification, and the accumulation of these seemingly reasonable steps led to outcomes that were undeniably monstrous. The civilians who died in Theramore's destruction were not soldiers. The Vale of Eternal Blossoms was a sacred place that had done nothing to threaten the Horde. The Iron Horde's invasion of Azeroth would have killed millions had it succeeded. At each stage, Garrosh chose the path of greater violence, greater extremism, greater willingness to harm innocents in pursuit of his goals. The theme of legacy runs throughout Garrosh's story, like a thread of crimson through brown cloth. He was defined first by his father's crimes, then by his father's redemption, then by his own attempt to surpass what either Grommash had achieved. The weight of the Hellscream name both elevated and crushed him, providing the foundation for his rise to power and the template for his fall. In trying to escape his father's shadow, he ultimately created a darker shadow of his own. The psychological dimensions of Garrosh's character have been explored by fans and critics alike. His childhood illness and isolation created patterns of abandonment and inadequacy that would manifest throughout his life. His discovery that his father was a hero as well as a villain created a complex emotional landscape that he never fully navigated. The pride that replaced his shame was, in many ways, just as harmful, masking wounds rather than healing them and preventing him from forming the genuine connections that might have moderated his worst impulses. The relationship between Garrosh and Thrall serves as the emotional core of much of his story. Thrall saw himself as a mentor and father figure to Garrosh, but he failed to provide the consistent guidance that such a role required. He gave Garrosh power without teaching him wisdom, authority without understanding, and then left him to face challenges alone when the cataclysm demanded his shamanic attention. Garrosh's resentment of Thrall, expressed so powerfully in their final confrontation, was rooted in a genuine sense of abandonment that even Thrall's apologists have difficulty entirely dismissing. The mentor-student dynamic between Thrall and Garrosh illuminates broader questions about the nature of leadership development and the responsibilities of those who elevate others to power. Thrall chose Garrosh not because he was the most qualified candidate, but because he saw in him a symbol of what the Horde could become. This decision, made for symbolic rather than practical reasons, would have consequences that neither orc could have anticipated. It suggests that leadership cannot be inherited or bestowed, but must be earned through experience and reflection. The counselors who might have guided Garrosh were themselves flawed or compromised. Cairn Bloodhoof, who might have provided the wisdom of age and experience, died before he could truly influence Garrosh's development as a leader. Vol'jin, who saw through Garrosh's limitations from the beginning, was marginalized rather than heeded. Sylvanas Windrunner had her own agenda that often conflicted with the Horde's best interests. There was no inner circle of trusted advisors to moderate Garrosh's worst impulses, no council of elders to provide checks on his authority. The isolation of power contributed to Garrosh's descent as much as any character flaw. Leadership, particularly the kind of absolute leadership that a warchief exercised, creates distance between the ruler and the ruled. Those who might have been friends become subjects, and subjects are never entirely honest with their masters. Garrosh heard only what the Kor'kron filtered to his ears, saw only what his intelligence services allowed him to see, and made decisions based on information that was shaped by the biases and fears of his subordinates. The women in Garrosh's story are notably absent, a reflection perhaps of the masculine warrior culture that shaped him. Unlike characters such as Thrall, who found balance and perspective through his relationship with Agra, Garrosh remained alone throughout his life. There is no record of romantic attachments, no mention of children, no indication that he ever formed the kind of intimate connections that might have humanized him or provided alternative perspectives on his choices. His isolation was not merely political, but deeply personal, a loneliness that fed his paranoia and his belief that only he could be trusted to act in the Horde's best interests. Pride was both Garrosh's defining characteristic and his fatal flaw. It was pride that made him a capable leader, that gave him the confidence to make difficult decisions and the charisma to inspire followers. But it was also pride that prevented him from accepting counsel, from admitting mistakes, from changing course when his chosen path led toward disaster. In Revendreth, the realm of pride, he became a literal embodiment of this quality, a soul so saturated with arrogance that it could be harvested for eternity without ever being exhausted. The question of whether Garrosh could have been redeemed is one that the story deliberately leaves unanswered. Other characters in Warcraft have committed terrible acts and found paths to redemption, from Illidan Stormrage to Kael'thas Sunstrider himself. But Garrosh never showed any interest in redemption, never acknowledged that his actions were wrong, never expressed remorse for the suffering he had caused. Even in the afterlife, faced with eternal torment, he chose destruction over submission, pride over peace. Perhaps this is the ultimate tragedy of Garrosh Hellscream. He possessed qualities that could have made him a great leader, a worthy successor to Thrall, a warchief who unified the Horde and brought it to new heights of glory. But those same qualities, unchecked by wisdom or tempered by compassion, twisted him into something that had to be destroyed for the good of everyone. The potential that Thrall saw in him was real, but so was the darkness that Thrall failed to anticipate. The contrast between Garrosh's potential and his reality serves as a meditation on the fragility of character. Small differences in circumstance, in timing, in the people who cross our paths at crucial moments can lead to vastly different outcomes. Had Garrosh learned of his father's redemption in a different way, had he found a true mentor rather than being thrust into leadership prematurely, had he developed genuine relationships that could ground him in reality rather than fantasy, he might have become the hero he imagined himself to be. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when pride is allowed to grow without the counterbalancing forces of wisdom and love. As you rest and let sleep claim you, consider the lessons embedded in this tale of ambition and fall. The weight of legacy can be either a foundation or a burden, depending on how we choose to bear it. Pride can fuel achievement or blind us to our own failings. The choices we make day by day and moment by moment accumulate into the shape of our lives, and by the time we recognize the pattern we have created, it may be too late to change it. Garrosh Hellscream was not a simple villain, though he committed villainous acts. He was not a misunderstood hero, though he had heroic qualities. He was a complex figure shaped by circumstances he did not choose and destroyed by choices he made freely. His story is one of the most comprehensive explorations of character in the Warcraft universe, a narrative that spans multiple expansions and explores themes that resonate far beyond the world of video games. The impact of Garrosh's story on the Horde cannot be overstated. His reign left scars that would take years to heal, divisions that in some cases would never fully close. The Tauren remembered Cairn's death, the Trolls remembered the assassination attempt on vol'jin, the Blood. Elves remembered being treated as second-class members of their own faction. Even among the orcs, there were those who had supported Garrosh to the end and those who had joined the rebellion, and the tensions between these groups persisted long after the siege of Orgrimmar ended. Vol'jin's ascension to the role of Warchief represented an explicit rejection of everything Garrosh had stood for. The Troll chieftain emphasized unity, cooperation, and the traditional values that Thrall had originally built the Horde upon. His leadership style was the antithesis of Garrosh's, collaborative where Garrosh had been dictatorial, patient where Garrosh had been impulsive. The contrast was deliberate, a conscious effort to heal the wounds that Garrosh's tyranny had inflicted on the Horde's body politic. But even vol'jin's wise leadership could not completely undo the damage. The world had seen what the Horde was capable of under the wrong leader, and trust that had taken years to build was shattered in moments by the destruction of Theramore. The Alliance viewed the Horde with renewed suspicion, and Jaina Proudmoore in particular never forgot or forgave what Garrosh had done. The possibility of peace between the factions, which had seemed achievable before Garrosh's rise, became a distant dream that would not resurface for years. The legacy of Garrosh's rule extended even into the structure of the Horde itself. After his fall, and later after vol'jin's death, the question of how to prevent another tyrant from seizing control of the Horde became increasingly urgent. The eventual solution, the creation of a council to lead the Horde rather than a single warchief, was a direct response to the lessons learned during Garrosh's reign. The title of Warchief, which had been the highest honor in Orcish society, became associated with tyranny and corruption, and the Horde ultimately chose to abolish it rather than risk another despot rising to claim it. For Thrall, the aftermath of Garrosh's fall was a period of profound reflection and spiritual crisis. The former warchief had made Garrosh what he was, had given him the power that he ultimately abused, and the weight of that responsibility bore heavily upon him. His shamanic connection to the elements weakened after the mak'gora in Nagrand, and some believed that this was not merely guilt, but the elements themselves judging him for how he had used their power. Thrall spent years trying to restore his connection to the spirits, a journey that forced him to confront his own role in Garrosh's rise and fall. The philosophical questions raised by Garrosh's story extend beyond the game itself, touching on universal themes of power, responsibility, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. What happens when leadership is given to those who are not prepared for it? How do we balance the need for strong leadership with the risk of tyranny? What responsibility do mentors bear for the failures of their students? These questions have no easy answers, but Garrosh's story provides a framework for exploring them. The nature of Garrosh's villainy defies simple categorization. He was not evil in the way of demons or old gods, entities whose malevolence is fundamental to their being. He was an orc who made choices, each one seeming reasonable from his perspective at the time, that accumulated into a pattern of atrocity. His tragedy lies precisely in the fact that he could have been different, that the potential for heroism existed within him alongside the capacity for destruction. The Garrosh who led victorious campaigns in Northrend was the same being who later ordered the destruction of Theramore. The difference was not in his nature, but in his choices. The role of circumstance in Garrosh's fall remains a subject of ongoing debate among those who study his story. Was he placed in an impossible situation, given power he was not equipped to handle, and then abandoned by those who should have supported him? Or did his fundamental character flaws make his downfall inevitable regardless of the circumstances he faced? The truth likely lies somewhere between these positions, a complex interplay of personality and situation that produced an outcome neither wholly predetermined nor entirely random. The relationship between Garrosh and his father's legacy illustrates one of the central themes of his story. He spent his youth crushed by shame over what Grommash had done, only to transform that shame into pride when he learned of his father's redemption. But neither extreme proved healthy. The shame paralyzed him, while the pride blinded him. What he never achieved was a balanced relationship with his heritage, one that acknowledged both the failures and the redemption while allowing him to chart his own course independent of either. For those who played through the events of Garrosh's story in World of Warcraft, the emotional journey was often profound. Here was a character who had been an ally, sometimes even admirable in his passion and courage, who transformed over the course of multiple expansions into a monster who had to be stopped. Watching that transformation, participating in it through quest lines and interactions, created a narrative experience that few video games have matched. Garrosh's story was not just told to players, but lived by them, making his eventual fall all the more impactful. Let the echoes of battle cries fade into the gentle quiet of approaching sleep. Let the tension of conflict dissolve into the peace of rest. The story of Garrosh Hellscream is complete, from his birth in shame to his death in defiance, to his final destruction in the realm of the damned. May you find in the slumber the peace that eluded him, and may your dreams be free of the burdens that broke him. The Hellscream name lives on in memory, a reminder of what pride can build and what pride can destroy. As consciousness fades and sleep deepens, let this tale settle into the foundations of understanding, another thread in the tapestry of stories that enrich our appreciation of imaginary worlds and the very real truths they illuminate. Rest well, and may your own story be one of balance, of wisdom, of lessons learned from those who came before. In the silence that follows the telling of tales, in the darkness that welcomes the weary to rest, the son of Hellscream joins the ranks of legendary figures whose stories shape how we understand heroism and villainy, ambition and destruction. Garrosh Hellscream is gone, but his legacy, like his father's before him, will endure as long as there are those who remember and learn from the chronicles of Azeroth. The echoes of Garrosh's story continue to resonate through the ongoing narrative of World of Warcraft. His decisions set in motion chains of events that would shape the world for years to come. The destruction of Theramore hardened Jaina Proudmoore into a figure very different from the peaceful diplomat she had once been. The corruption of the Veil left scars on Pandaria that would take generations to heal. The creation of the Iron Horde opened doors between timelines that would have consequences no one could have predicted. And in the hearts of those who played through his story, Garrosh remains a figure of fascination and debate. Was he a villain who deserved his fate, or a tragic figure who might have been saved with better guidance? Was his pride a fatal flaw, or in the end, his only remaining virtue? These questions keep his memory alive, ensuring that the son of Hellscream will not be forgotten, even as new threats rise and new heroes emerge to face them. The Horde that exists today is shaped by the lessons learned from Garrosh's reign. The council that now leads is a direct response to the dangers of concentrated power. The emphasis on unity and cooperation between races reflects the divisions that Garrosh created and exploited, Even the relationship between the Horde and Alliance has been permanently altered by the events of his tenure as Warchief. His shadow falls across every decision, every alliance, every moment of tension between factions. Sleep now and let the story do its work, settling into memory as dreams carry you through the night. Tomorrow awaits with its own challenges and choices, its own opportunities to build legacies worth inheriting. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that you have journeyed through one of Warcraft's most complex and compelling narratives, the complete story of Garrosh Hellscream, son of Grommash, Warchief of the Horde, and soul who chose destruction over submission in the very end. As your consciousness fades into the realm of dreams, carry with you the lessons of this tale. The burden of legacy need not define us if we choose our own path. Pride can be a strength when tempered with wisdom and compassion, and even the most promising beginnings can lead to tragic ends if we fail to recognize the warning signs along the way. Rest now, and may your own story be one of balance, growth, and the courage to change when change is needed. The stars wheel overhead in the endless dance of the cosmos, indifferent to the struggles of mortals below. Empires rise and fall, heroes emerge and perish, and the stories that are told around campfires and in quiet moments before sleep carry the wisdom of ages to those who listen. The story of Garrosh Hellscream is one such tale, a narrative of ambition and downfall that speaks to something fundamental in the experience of striving for greatness. May the elements watch over you as you rest. May the spirits of your ancestors guide your dreams, and may you wake refreshed and ready to write your own story, one choice at a time, one day at a time, building a legacy that will be remembered with pride rather than shame. The tale of Garrosh Hellscream is complete. Now sleep and let peace find you in the quiet hours of the night.